The story begins on a stormy night. The wind was howling at full force. The rain was pouring down as if from a huge watering can. But a certain elderly man did not want to sit at home. Instead, he knocked on the door of his acquaintances. The door was opened for him by a red-haired middle-aged man, and he, of course, immediately recognized the guest. How could it be otherwise if these two were old friends from the same village, and one even helped the other not to go broke gambling? The old man reminded his young friend that after that incident the latter had sworn an oath to certainly repay for his help, and the red-haired man immediately tensed up, expecting the worst until his wife spoke out loud. The couple most likely expected the visitor to demand that they repay the debt in cash or ask for some dangerous adventure, but instead, to their great surprise, he pushed forward a little girl who looked like two peas in a pod with the blonde and green-eyed mistress of the house. As it turned out, the little girl was the old man's orphaned granddaughter. Both her parents had died, and she was only 8 years old, unable to take care of herself, let alone take her on the difficult journey to El Dorado. The old baron dreamed of this great golden city of the New World and desperately wanted its riches, so much so that he eventually decided to leave his only granddaughter Hazel in the care of some villagers he knew, leaving them no choice but to refuse. Naturally, after this, some discord began in the family. The woman looked with resentment and disbelief at her husband, who had hidden such a promise from her, and he, with trembling hands, begged for forgiveness. Betrayed trust is not so easy to heal. That's what could be read in the lady's eyes, and then both she and the good-for-nothing husband measured the silent little girl with long glances. Despite the fact that she was related to an aristocrat, albeit an insignificant one, Hazel was poorly dressed. If you looked closely, you could appreciate both the old boots of different styles and the ancient torn dress. The mistress of the house understood everything immediately, and it was as if a huge and very heavy stone lay on her heart. She did not immediately tell her newly adopted daughter that she now belonged to their house. Of course, the couple set one condition. The girl would work just like their biological children, Emily, Belle, and Noel, who finally came running to the noise and looked at the unfamiliar child with huge eyes. After some hesitation, Hazel meekly replied, "Yes, Mrs. Mateen." And then there was a small time skip, moving the action forward a month. By that time the rains had stopped, and the sky was clear and bright again. The couple sat down to breakfast, and the husband immediately tensed up when his wife cautiously started talking about their adopted daughter. He never forgot that this situation was the result of his fault. The wife, however, had no intention of reproaching her lover. Instead, she sadly told him that the main character invariably called her Mrs. or Mrs. Mateen, no matter what the conversation was about. Looking thoughtfully into her cup of drink, the wife added that the new child was behaving too diligently and quietly. As soon as he woke up, he immediately went to work, never argued and hardly talked to those around him. After hearing all this, the man made a reasonable assumption that the little girl was simply ashamed. She felt like some kind of parasite, a hanger-on, so she was trying her best to be as useful as possible and at the same time invisible. And he didn't see anything serious in this. He just needed to give the girl a little more time. Then she would thaw out and stop seeing her new relatives as something like an evil stepmother from fairy tales. Instead of answering, Mrs. Matten asked her husband to go and mend the fence, lest that robber Peter attack the chicken coop again. And the man, instantly embarrassed, promised to do so. Having finished his breakfast, he slowly walked out the door and cast a careful glance around his domain, while a large, fat guard dog was peacefully dozing nearby. His wife, meanwhile, stretched so that it seemed that one could easily hear the quiet crunch of her vertebrae, the consequences of daily and hard work around the house. Alas, no matter how much she wanted to forget about the problem and go lie on the bed for days, she still had to focus on things: cleaning, cooking, checking on the children, and other usual routines. Matten couldn't decide whether to really push Hazel when she turned 10, and she thought about it so deeply that she automatically gave her adopted daughter permission to do something. A little later, while washing clothes in the open air, the lady of the family sadly admitted that the children could not cope with running a farm. It was simply beyond their capabilities. Only at that moment did it suddenly dawn on the woman that it was not one of her biological offspring who had approached her with that question, but an adopted daughter abandoned by the adventurer Baron. One could ask what is so strange about this, but the answer was already given a little earlier. The protagonist never made contact, answered as respectfully and succinctly as possible, and then suddenly she contacted me herself, albeit for work. Now the venerable matron reflexively continued to rub the dirty fabric against the hard surface, but her mind was in completely different places, namely in attempts to understand what it was all about. Perhaps this was the long-awaited break in the ice between her and the main character. In any case, Matten herself desperately hoped for this. It could easily be read in her large green eyes. After this, the woman returned home with a basket of clean, damp laundry, and with noticeable surprise stared at something like a wooden table, from which for some reason small green plants were growing. It was so strange that she didn't even pay attention to her son Noel, who was trying to show his mother something. She just reflexively took his small hands. While the boy hugged his mother, she continued to wonder how this had happened at all. After all, these shoots should have been mercilessly washed away by a long and strong downpour. With eyes shining with delight, the little boy explained that it was all Hazel's fault. She had collected and replanted the plants because no one had had time to explain to her that they should be thrown away. If these were new specimens of flora, there would be no questions, but Matten understood perfectly well that these were the same flowers that had been destroyed by the storm and thrown out, but now they looked so healthy and whole, as if nothing had happened. It looked like some kind of witchcraft, but the protagonist herself calmly explained that she was simply carefully examining and stroking the bean sprouts, demonstrating the same attention and respect to them as to people. And this, among other things, allowed Hazel to sense their strongest desires. For example, some bean sprouts desperately needed water, and the girl rushed to water them. Other plants were poorly planted and needed to be buried deeper, while others suffered from lack of sunlight but immediately recovered when they were placed in a more suitable location. Another person would have limited herself to this, but the good-natured girl also tried to morally support her new favorites, as if they were not just sprouts, but children. The couple looked at each other with very long, intent glances. How else are you supposed to react when an adopted child suddenly demonstrates real witchcraft? Then they seemed to recover from the sudden icing and loudly declared in one voice that it must be Mano del Sol, which translates from Spanish as hands of the sun. But this was not some kind of trivial magic, but a miraculous gift from higher powers, and it was not limited to plants, even animals, under the influence of this power, gave birth to numerous and healthy offspring. A person who was lucky enough to acquire such an ability seemed to become the chosen one of the great god of agriculture and fertility. The earth sang from his touch and generously gave away its fruits. Naturally, the Mattens were incredibly happy to see this with their own eyes, and they surrounded Hazel as if she were some kind of mythical fairy, much to her embarrassment. And then numerous offspring of the farmers joined them. Everyone wanted to carefully examine the wonderful hands, from which even hopelessly dead organic matter gained new life. The main character looked at her new family with wide, shining eyes and rosy cheeks. It was difficult to say whether such attention frightened her or, on the contrary, made her happy. Then the girl asked timidly if it was possible to try growing something else, and the father of the family, of course, supported this initiative with great pleasure. Trying to appear good-natured and at the same time to instill confidence in his adopted daughter, the man rose to his feet, stretched out his legs, and asked Hazel to come closer to him. What happened next was very reminiscent of an idealistic picture based on some pastoral work, a family of farmers happily running through a field of green grass, while their head and mother watched this from the sidelines with a smile. She snorted a little derisively, seeing how her husband himself behaved like a child, but there was no contempt in this gesture. In the end, their family became whole again and truly friendly. Then the protagonist demonstrated new facets of her gift with great enthusiasm, and the adoptive father watched this very carefully, his mouth open in surprise. Then Mrs. Matten helped the main character influence the apple tree, and from the girl's presence the fruits seemed to begin to slowly grow larger and fill with juice. Another time, the girl helped look after a young bull, and he fawned over her with great pleasure, demonstrating every kind of trust and warmth towards his new owner, and even licked her face. But it wasn't just about quantity. As one might think, Mano del Sol also improved the quality of products, making even the most trivial things incredibly healthy and tasty. This turned the little orphan into a first-class housewife, capable of turning even the simplest dish into a first-class meal, as she did, creating pies for the whole family. Mrs. Matten helped drizzle the sweet liquid and sprinkle sugar over the dough, and then, when they were completely set, she carefully tasted them and happily gave Hazel a thumbs up. At that moment, it would have been impossible to imagine that there had once been alienation and tension between these people. Now no one would have been able to distinguish them from a happy mother and daughter. After some time, the matron with a calm and peaceful face was knitting. Now nothing was bothering her, and the future seemed bright and wonderful. The rest of the family had gone mushroom picking, and were now returning joyfully with baskets filled to the brim with the delicious fruit bodies. With the protagonist's gift, any other outcome would have been difficult to achieve, to be honest. The girl was incredibly happy. Marked by the power of the solar deity, patron of fertility, she now seemed like a warm bundle of optimism and happiness. It was a very striking contrast to how Hazel looked when she first met the Mateen family. Then she resembled a battered, rain-soaked sparrow, but now she happily hugged her adoptive mother to general laughter. Thinking about how complicated and ambiguous life can be, how strangely black and white stripes intertwine in it, the woman frowned sadly. However, she did not allow her doubts to affect the festive atmosphere that had set in, so she only hugged her adopted daughter tighter to the general laughter. Again, if someone outsider had wandered onto this farm and accidentally caught the main characters doing this, they would have been amazed at how joyful, happy, and friendly a family they had become in a matter of days. But all this was not a full-fledged beginning of the story, but only a long prologue. The events really unfolded when the audience was made aware that the Baron, Hazel's long-lost grandfather, had returned. Just like the first time, the old man arrived at night when the skies were drenching the earth with torrential rain, and Noel looked at it from the window with noticeable fear and excitement. The aristocrat very politely and affably addressed his old acquaintances through the door and walls, asking how they were doing, and the rest of the Matten clan looked at each other with no less fear. Without waiting for permission, the traveler entered the house and asked where his daughter was waiting, and one of the girls very unconvincingly lied that she had no idea where Hazel was. The Baron looked at the husband and wife with a very suspicious, hard look, and once again repeated the question of where his daughter was, which made the spouses hesitate, began to hide their eyes and mumble something. The readers were not shown how the unpleasant conversation unfolded further, but after some time the old man went out into the street, accompanied by a sweating man, and abruptly opened the gate of another building. It was something inside the barn, inside which was a small tuft of straw, and something was scurrying around in it, possessing familiar brown pigtails. And the nobleman immediately noticed it, without listening to the incoherent explanations of the debtor. Without saying another word, the old man grabbed Hazel by the arm and forced her out and to her feet. She was very packed and puffed up about what had happened. Eventually, the girl pulled her hand out of her grandfather's grip and screamed loudly that she did not want to leave this farm. On the contrary, she wanted to stay and live here. The Baron stared at his granddaughter with genuine surprise. No matter how friendly he was to others, he remained a noble, a product of the feudal system, and such a statement was something incredible for him. Only after this was the head of the family able to more or less clearly explain that the protagonist sincerely loves farming and that she has an innate talent for it. In response, the aristocrat looked at the red-haired man with genuine hostility and anger and sternly reminded him that the girl was the only heir of Mr. Mayfield, that is his. While the adults argued and talked, deciding the fate of the little girl, Hazel herself gave them a very sad, tearful look, one that could melt even the iciest heart. But it didn't help against real snow. When the little brunette went outside, she was surprised to discover that during the night the ground had become covered not with mud and rain, but with snow and ice. She was very depressed that she would have to leave the place where she first felt happy after the death of her parents, and for the first time told readers the names of the parents of the Matten clan, Carl and Massa. The main character curtsied to them as befitted a little aristocrat and tearfully thanked them for the happy times spent in their house. It seemed that the unpleasant farewell would drag on for a long time because neither side could quickly say goodbye to the other, but then the farmers quietly handed the brunette a basket of food. The woman was clearly very sad and in pain, but she hid it very well. Instead, a smile blossomed on the face of the respectable matron, and her cheeks turned a deep pink. Then Carl patted his former adopted daughter on the head. The eldest daughter did the same, restraining herself, and the younger ones, not at all embarrassed, rushed to hug and cry. Matin suggested that the protagonist could visit them in the future at any time she wanted, and the heroine spent a long time seeing them off at home with tears, looking out the window of the departing carriage. From the outside, it really did give the impression of a quiet pastoral abode, devoid of flashy and pompous luxury, but beautiful and attractive in its ordinariness and homeliness. Mayfield slept soundly, blowing bubbles in his sleep like a baby, and the protagonist, finally forcing herself to look away from the window, stared at the gift basket instead. There were many different vegetables in it: peppers, potatoes, cabbage, carrots, and others, and the young aristocrat pressed this treasure to her heart as if it were the most precious treasure, more valuable than any gold. It was then that Hazel made a silent vow to herself to have her own farm, and 11 years have passed since then, taking the audience to Rochelle, a small town in the center of the kingdom. Over all these years, the main character has hardly changed in appearance, except that she has become taller and, in addition, she got a job at a bank, and with a polite smile told some woman that her account had been successfully opened. Then she turned her gaze to the young man sitting in a chair nearby, reading a newspaper. The young man had very light, almost cream-colored hair, and was dressed in rich clothes. In his newspaper, the protagonist managed to make out that someone was selling a farm for 8,000 gold coins, and this is such a colossal amount that the brunette almost fainted from shock. The girl could have banged her head against her desk for a long time, amazed at someone's greed, but then the head of the bank walked by and Hazel had to stop her quiet hysteria. The working hours flowed one after another, like drops of water in an ancient timekeeping mechanism, and at some point, a colleague asked the heroine whether she would be going to that very bakery. After the end of the working day, the brunette headed there. This modest store, located under the bridge, was very tempting with its extremely high prices, for which it was possible to endure many inconveniences. She walked down the street, dreamily anticipating how she would dine on wonderful, fragrant bread, but someone's joyful and suspiciously familiar voice pulled her out of these sweet fantasies. It turned out to be old Baron Mayfield, and the protagonist's grandfather looked more than extravagant, with a straw hat on a string, a colorful shirt with flamingos and summer knee-length trousers. Of course, Hazel was glad to see her only remaining relative, but she was very interested in two questions: where he had gone this time, and why the respectable aristocrat was dressing like he was on a tropical beach, while being in a typical European climate, and even in the middle of spring. Squinting slyly, as if sharing a closely guarded but exciting secret with the brunette, the grandfather admitted that he had gone to Mamanuca and had finally managed to hit the jackpot there. However, the main character did not feel any enthusiasm about this. She had lived with Mayfield all her life, and knew perfectly well that such statements were better divided in 2, or even 4. With a heavy sigh, the brunette simply asked her relative to go home. She was very tired after the previous working day, and now desperately wanted to relax. Before setting off on her journey, the protagonist gave her grandfather some money so that he could buy food to prepare a tasty and filling dinner, and the Baron stared at his granddaughter with eyes full of tears and gratitude. The aristocrat would have done all this with great pleasure, but now he had more important things to do, and with an intriguing look, he handed the brown-haired woman a large bundle of some kind of paper. It was a deed of land ownership. As it turned out, Mayfield knew perfectly well that Hensel dreamed of farming more than anything else in the world, and now he had finally managed to fulfill his granddaughter's deepest desire. He tried, however, not to acknowledge his kindness, reducing it all to grumbling about how the girl had done nothing but regale her ancestor with her endless talk about farms for the past 10 years. Of course, this grumbling actually didn't deceive anyone, and in fact the Baron himself was very happy, because now they have their own land on which they can do whatever they want. And then the elderly aristocrat launched into his own fantasies about how great it would be to grow a variety of fruits and vegetables, and Hazel listened to all this with a slightly mocking but warm smile. At some point, the protagonist interrupted her relative and directly asked whether he had really bought the farm. Mayfield, embarrassed, admitted that in fact it was more of a vegetable garden. But he was quick to explain that things weren't as bad as they might seem. It was a decent-sized, fertile area that could easily be turned into full-fledged agricultural land. The sun often shone there, and there was a comfortable house to live in. Then the man began to boast that there were carriage stops, shops, food outlets, and a bunch of other benefits of civilization nearby. But the heroine, like a hound, clung to the casually thrown phrase that, "There is nothing in this wonderful place now." The Baron's answer made the protagonist's jaw drop to the ground. As it turned out, this whole pastoral utopia was located right in the center of the royal capital. The aristocrat hastened to assure that this was of absolutely no importance. The main thing was that their family had the opportunity to add an additional allotment. Otherwise, what if their superiors took away their wealth again? Hazel, worried, asked what all this meant, and then Mayfield, looking away, quietly admitted that many years ago he had participated in an auction, won, and bought a typical vegetable patch with a tiny house in the main city of the kingdom for a very cheap price. And everything would have been fine, but one day a greedy and ambitious rich man appeared who bought up all the buildings in the area in order to reconstruct them for his own benefit. So, their little house turned out to be the last plot of land in the district that had not yet been eaten by this business shark. But if Mayfield or Hazel did not show up and confirm their rights by the 2nd of May, their garden would be declared no man's land and would be destroyed. The brunette was incredibly outraged that someone could actually allow themselves to treat someone else's property in such a swinish manner, but her grandfather calmed her down, reminding her that all the documents were legitimate, and if she managed to arrive before the beginning of May, there would be no trouble. However, the protagonist needs to decide right now and set off on her journey immediately. Time is short, the road is long, and only she can protect her dream. The girl carefully read all the documents again and stared at the place where her full name was written, Hazel Edwina May, and from the realization that she could really become the owner of the farm, a shiver ran through the heroine's body. For a few seconds she desperately tried to calm her excitement, but in the end she couldn't stand it, and with happy tears she threw herself on the neck of her grandfather, who had given her the best gift possible. For a moment, the girl completely forgot about the mysterious capitalist buying up the land and all her other problems. The main thing was that she now had her own plot of land. Watching her with incredible affection, Mayfield confirmed that yes, this was real reality, and not just a very vivid and credible dream about a dream come true. The protagonist assured her grandfather that everything would go well. After all, she had worked in a bank for most of her life and knew perfectly well how all these tricks worked, so the Baron looked at her with genuine pride. He, of course, never even doubted his relative, but he was still very happy with such determination, so he affectionately patted his granddaughter on the head. Soon after that, they separated, but the girl still held the treasured documents to her chest for a long time. For her, it was the most precious and beloved treasure. After some time, she, disheveled and still dazed with joy, returned to work, where her boss began to scold her for being late and her shabby appearance, threatening to fire her, and Hazel easily agreed. There was a dramatic silence, as if all the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving only a vacuum. So shocked was the banker by the indifference to his threats. He stood there for some time, frozen with anger and irritation, and the main character, carefreely whistling a song, went to fill out the paperwork for her dismissal. The whole procedure went extremely quickly. The girl simply scribbled "statement" on a piece of paper very quickly and handed it to her former boss, while he thoughtfully rubbed his head and mumbled. On the way home, Edwina May felt not so much like a human being as like a fairy, light as air, rushing at full speed towards the fulfillment of her most cherished dream. It would seem that the future was going to be cloudless and happy, but this time there was a very unpleasant but. In this case, it had the appearance of a handsome young man with red eyes, golden hair, and noble clothes. The unknown youth coldly and solemnly announced the beginning of a discussion of state affairs, and at the same time looked at someone in front of him in such a way that anyone's hand would have reached for a pistol. After this, the audience is shown two young people, a girl with black hair and a red-haired boy. The first was suffering from fatigue, and the second calmly noted that traffic jams in these parts are common, but today the delay is especially long. They were riding in a large carriage, complaining about how the roads were completely clogged after the recent celebration, until the boy noticed that someone was getting out to walk to their destination. It was, of course, the protagonist. This time, instead of a strict business dress, she was wearing a cute and light summer outfit, and her head was covered by a pink, wide-brimmed hat. It was May 2nd, the very day Hazel had to officially claim her tiny plot of land, and she managed to safely reach Avalon, the capital of the state. Despite the beautiful and sonorous name, in general it was an ordinary city, comparable to the European metropolises of the Renaissance era. Busy people were scurrying around everywhere, and Edwina herself was focused on finding the road. She studied the map for a long time and carefully, trying to choose the shortest route to her new home, when suddenly someone yelled right in her ear, "Grand Cavalier," which almost made the girl jump out of her pants. It turned out to be a rather tipsy old man with a little girl on his shoulders. He kindly explained that the people were celebrating in honor of the king and also greeted Hazel on her arrival in the capital. After this, the main character wandered for some time along the well-kept and clean streets of Avalon, thoughtfully looking around in an obvious attempt to find a free carriage. At the same time, the audience was shown her fresh memories about how the aforementioned drunkard told about the changes that had begun in the capital since the fashion for the wholesale reconstruction of everything and everyone began. From this conversation, it also became known that in the world of the work, there are not only people and gods but also other creatures. For example, a certain Captain Siegbald, who came from the royal castle, had connections with berserker bears. The explanation for why such information had never surfaced before was extremely trivial. Hazel, to her own shame, ignored most sections and news in the newspapers, except those that concerned the care of the land and crops. At the moment, the main character continued walking down the street, carefully checking the map, when she suddenly came across a beautiful pink bow that someone had thrown away. It turned out to be a fallen piece of props from another festive shield in honor of the king, and the protagonist thought that the ruler must be one of the three great masters of fencing. His Majesty ascended the throne at only 22 years of age, but he quickly proved himself to be an extraordinary ruler. Together with his friends, popularly known as Holy Knights, he captured countries and pacified the rebellious. In addition to his ambition, sharp mind, and remarkable military talent, this man also stood out for his feminine, even inhuman beauty, at least if we take the assertions of the court sycophants at face value. The main character, however, didn't really care about this. After all, what difference does it make whether the ruler is handsome or ugly if the taxes remain the same in any case? All the way she pondered what kind of potato would be best grown in Avalon's soil and climate, until she finally reached the right place and her mouth dropped open in incredible shock. And there was a reason for that. The map led the protagonist to the gates of a luxurious mansion, which looked as if some semi-divine elven king could emerge from it at any moment. For a few seconds, the brunette hesitated, feeling like a dirty and unsightly mouse who dared to show up in a rich kitchen, but then she pulled herself together and bravely stepped inside. Even though most of the area now belonged to just one person, it still took Hazel a while to figure out where her new garden and home could be. Guided by the papers, the girl at some point came out into a small, beautiful park, decorated with a sculpture of Ramstein I, an elegant sovereign in armor and with long hair. Then it was necessary to pass by a large government chamber, reminiscent of a fairy tale castle, and also to go around an equally ornate and large fountain. In addition, at some point, the brunette walked past a pair of young soldiers guarding the chambers of a high-born person, and they seemed more like statues than living people. And then, in general, the situation was no better. The main character, like Alice, who found herself in Wonderland, constantly wandered from one strange place to another, periodically losing her way, trying to find the right route. Eventually, Hazel managed to sort out this trouble and come to what seemed to be the right place, a luxurious estate surrounded by equally magnificent gardens and gazebos. The spectacle was so impressive that even the practical and down-to-earth protagonist caught her breath for a few seconds. It was as if she had found herself alive in a strange but very beautiful fairy tale. But the greatest delight, which made the girl's green eyes shine like two cut emeralds, was not caused by this luxury, but by the realization of the fact that the treasured house with a garden should be very close. And so it was. Edwina May only had to literally turn her head to the side to finally see her tiny plot in the form of a small but beautiful and neat house, surrounded by a white fence. The brunette had probably never felt such a feeling of being in love in her life as she did at that moment. She wanted to jump and dance madly, and her eyes seemed to be covered with rose-colored glasses. Yes, it was not at all the huge grove of hundreds of trees or the huge pasture with herds of cattle that Hazel dreamed about, but damn it, it was her own real vegetable garden. Of course, even right away, it was clear that such a dwelling had at least one drawback. Its inhabitants could not easily see the magnificent park next door. But on the other hand, the house itself was very beautiful, almost a fairy tale palace in miniature, and from Edwina's point of view, this was more than enough to make any desire to complain disappear. Although no, there was another unpleasantness, and even the beauty of the garden plot could not soften it. This huge, shiny, like a box of jewelry, castle in the center of the park, standing out too much against the background of the rest of the landscape. Another person would have dropped their jaw to the ground at the sight of such magnificence, but May considered it simply tasteless. And, characteristically, it took her a while to realize that right next to her stood not even a mansion, but a real palace. Then the overall picture began to take shape in her head like pieces of a mosaic. She remembered how she passed by a beautiful sculpture depicting the founder of the current ruling dynasty. Then the enormous building of the government chamber appeared before her eyes again, and for the first time the girl did not even attach any significance to it, perceiving it as an unimportant piece of landscape. And finally, a couple of soldiers that Hazel had seen near one of the passages. And again, she hadn't even bothered to think about why such people were guarding the area. The protagonist felt as if she had been struck by lightning. She was truly horrified by the fact that she had been so stupid and had allowed herself to be carried away by her own fantasies to such an extent, without regard for reality. The reason for such a sharp reaction was very simple. Edwina, looking for her coveted garden, managed to get into the personal possessions of the king himself, the godlike ruler of vast lands. Meanwhile, the monarch himself felt strange. His ears began to itch sharply and intensely, and the blonde assumed that at that moment someone decided to rent out his story. If we return to the main character, it's as if she died inside. Her cherished dream immediately went down the drain, and the girl was ready to immediately go back, because where has it been seen? To sue the king. Malefield, wanting to please his granddaughter, only did her a disservice. Now Hazel felt like some kind of disgusting cockroach who dared to defile the beautiful and clean kitchen with his presence. But after a few seconds, the protagonist's mood completely turned around 180 degrees, and she again began to behave as if nothing unusual had just happened. She really forgot that she would be living next door to the ruler of her country and that she would have to sue him as if he were an ordinary person. The main thing was that now she had her own little vegetable garden. Hazel was so overwhelmed with joy that she fell off her feet, and then she even began to talk to the soil, lulling it as if it were a living creature. From the first cursory assessment, the main character realized that the soil was very fertile, and in addition, nothing had grown on it for a long time except grass and a few trees, which meant that she had had plenty of rest. Then the woman remembered her promise to her grandfather, the Baron, that she would definitely claim her territory and would not allow anyone to take it away. Several minutes passed, during which time May managed to put up a table and write on it the name of her new farm, Marinière, proud of the thought that even the king would not be able to kick her out, because the rules were the same for everyone. But even if he dared, the brunette felt brave enough to fight back even against such a powerful man. But she wanted to get to work even more. This lady's words and actions were in line. After a short period of time, she was buttoning up her apron with the most decisive look to protect her clothes from dirt. Then she picked up a basket filled to the brim with various bottles of seeds, potions, and also a shovel for spot weeding the soil. Now she was a real gardener with capital letters, equipped with everything she needed from head to toe, and so inspired that if a king appeared before Hazel right now, she would weed him too, mistaking him for another plot of land. But before starting, the protagonist paused with some timidity on the threshold because there was really a lot of work to be done. The entire area had already become overgrown with wild vegetation of various kinds. However, this moment of timidity passed very quickly. Then May returned to her previous behavior and looked forward to how she would spend the next 2 hours messing around with her favorite flora. At first, like any gardener, she was going to rid the area of weeds, but her attention was caught by something else, and it turned out to be a torn and slightly dented potato stalk. A casual observer and most farmers would not have paid any attention to this trifle, but this enthusiastic fan of agriculture shone brighter than the sun in the sky. She will now have her own first potato harvest. Her keen eye also immediately identified what other useful plants were nearby, and while most people would only see the same herb, Hazel immediately identified rosemary, mint, sage, and a host of other important sprouts. This sight made the protagonist smile like a hungry hamster who has finally gotten his hands on the sacred seed reserves and snort very contentedly. Edwina quickly pulled the vials of seeds out of her bag, getting ready to begin the most enjoyable part of the job, while tempting images of a rich harvest flashed through her mind one after another. This thought made the girl smile smugly again, this time in the style of a well-fed cat who had come up with a brilliant combination to get to the plate of sour cream. After this, the work finally began, and as she pulled out another weed, the woman thought that even in her earliest childhood, she had accomplished this task with unnatural ease. Ordinary people often have to work hard to uproot the pest with all its roots, but Hazel, the chosen one of the god of fertility, only needed to pull her fingers slightly for the weed to jump out of the soil itself, so the work went smoothly. Naturally, this circumstance could not help but please the brunette, and she, rolling up her sleeves, firmly intended to complete the first stage of the plan before the day turned into a crimson sunset. Meanwhile, a group of young nobles were happily discussing how they had finally gotten rid of the hated house number 79. It had been a pain in the ass for them for a long time, but now they could breathe a sigh of relief. Then one of them whispered in the ear of the other, the most important one, that even the powers that be differ greatly from each other, and even the current sovereign has certain quirks, and the head of the group could not deny this. The fair-haired nobleman had not yet finished his gloating speech about the demolition of the garden house when he noticed that there was someone there. Could it be that some boys had decided to smoke again, secretly from those around them? Before Hazel's arrival, this area had indeed served as a secret base for the local youth, where they could indulge in forbidden entertainment without the adults knowing, and this irritated the nobles much more than the very fact that there was some miserable vegetable garden nearby. Then the attention of the aristocrats was drawn to a strange noise, and its source, of course, turned out to be the main character, who, with eyes shining with delight, was weeding, pulling out and throwing out one weed after another. This sight surprised the high-born blonde so much that he didn't even get angry right away. In the first minutes, he could only widen his eyes in shock and whisper, "What?" The unfortunate inspector seemed to have turned into a pillar of salt, unable to understand how he should react to such a sight, and the two remaining noblemen, like faithful parrots, whispered in the leader's ear that they themselves did not know what was going on here. And Edwina only now noticed the uninvited guests, and not very respectfully asked what they needed here at all. She decided to herself that she would immediately act firmly. May added that she was pulling weeds, implying that she had no time or desire to waste energy on empty talk, and the inspector, still not having recovered from the shock, repeated his quiet, inarticulate, "What?" The protagonist kindly explained that before starting any work on the land, it was necessary to rid the soil of pests, and the fair-haired nobleman only now came out of his stupor, asking whether the brunette really intended to build a farm here. The woman confirmed with a smile that she did, and then the inspector became openly angry. He decided that he was dealing with some kind of crazy woman who did not understand whose company she was in, and ordered his henchmen to throw Hazel out. But before the men even touched her, the main character resolutely rose to her feet, put her hands on her hips, and angrily asked, "Do these nobles even know who she is?" A tension like lightning struck reigned. The inspector, folding his arms across his chest, retorted that such words were thrown around by those who in fact were nothing special, and if the brunette were the only daughter of the Golden Dragon, it might have worked. Edwina admitted with a smile that, yes, she had nothing to do with any dragons, but still, even His Majesty the King would not be able to kick her out, simply because she was a malefield. The man was again so deeply shocked that he could only whisper inaudibly, "What?" while the protagonist made faces at her opponent with great glee and self-satisfaction. Having come to his senses a little, the inspector asked whether May meant Archibald Sebastian Malefield, the owner of the property, who could not be found in any way, and the brunette happily confirmed this, showing her documents. The main character, not even hiding her pleasure, explained that this was proof of her identity, and here were the papers confirming her rights to the plot, and the aristocrat stared at them with such an unhappy face, as if he was violently sick. He couldn't help but admit that the documents were genuine, and that simply kicking the girl in the ass wouldn't work. And so he stared at the protagonist, who was glowing with self-satisfaction, with real hatred. With her sudden appearance, Hazel managed to ruin some of the fair-haired aristocrat's plans, so now he could only sigh in irritation and rub his aching head. Having mastered his emotions, the man politely but coldly apologized for his rudeness, because no one could have expected that the legitimate heir would appear only at the very last moment, but the king's representatives would like to buy the territory from her. Waving his hand towards the surrounding area, the blonde explained that all the other plots had been purchased by the crown for 480 gold coins, but if the main character wished, they would pay her the full 600 for selling the farm. Maintaining an outward politeness, the internal inspector was gloating. He considered Edwina a complete fool who did not understand anything about this life, so it would not be difficult to fool her. Looking away, the girl admitted with some timidity that yes, a whole 600 full-weight gold coins was indeed a colossal sum for someone like her. The nobleman had already mentally begun to celebrate his victory. He had no doubt that this narrow-minded country bumpkin would sell not only her vegetable garden, but even her own mother, if he paid enough, and the man even took out a piece of paper to sign the transfer of the plot. But the main character only looked at her opponent in response and asked how many times he had to repeat that there would be no deals, and at that moment the air itself became heavy with Hazel's hidden thirst for blood. Such iron determination and peremptoriness not only unsettled the blonde, but even frightened him, and when May forcefully thrust the shovel into the soil, the aristocrat gasped and jumped away. Tears of childish resentment appeared in the eyes of this high-born, adult, and serious gentleman, and even the two other noblemen who followed the inspector around like a little tail began to whisper mockingly, asking what to do now. Hazel, meanwhile, seemed to have turned into a terrible giantess, gloating over the insignificant nobleman, like he thought that I was a complete fool who could easily be outwitted on a crooked goat. But no, just the opposite. The unfortunate nobleman realized that in this situation he himself would not achieve anything, and he needed to quickly return to the ministers. And after that, the audience was transferred to the hall of the main hall of the palace of the King of Britannia. The current ruler, a young, fair-haired man with scarlet eyes, was just making his next decision, and the court sycophants readily began to praise his unprecedented wisdom. While the powers that be continued their meeting, the ever-memorable inspector was shaking behind the door, asking someone when the reception would finally end and it would be possible to talk with the ministers. Then the sovereign coldly inquired what that strange noise was under the door, and the nobleman almost fell off his feet. Could the sovereign really hear his quiet words from such a distance? Realizing that there was no way back, the fair-haired nobleman walked out into the hall, introduced himself as a member of the royal court department, and those around him began to whisper in confusion about what this was all about. Trying to keep his voice from shaking, the inspector reminded the governor that not long ago, the latter had decided to implement the Victory Memorial Project, for which he had built a large building, planted a garden around it, and bought up almost all the private land in the area. And now, at the very last moment, a snag appeared. When everyone was already sure that Plot 79 would also go to the crown, the owner suddenly showed up and warned that she would make a farm there. The rest of the courtiers, hearing this, were taken aback. After all, what kind of madman do you have to be to build some kind of bourgeois vegetable garden in the middle of a magnificent park erected by His Majesty? One of the aristocrats, fat and red-haired, scornfully remarked that this was real vulgarity, although swindlers generally love to drag decent people through the mud by deception. Another, older and gray-haired, was outraged that Hazel planned to make big money under the government's nose by depriving an important government project of a necessary piece of land. The only one who remained calm was the Tsar himself. He even accused his advisors of hypocrisy, reminding them that they themselves were constantly pulling off various schemes just to get more money into their pockets. Those around him, horrified, tried to convince the ruler that this was not so, but it was too late. The king warned in a loud and commanding voice that this whole situation with the farm was nothing more than an abuse of a loophole, and in the future such behavior would be mercilessly punished. And the first example of royal justice was destined to be the newly minted owner of the farm. The sovereign ordered him to be stripped naked and then thrown out the gate so that everyone could see how attempts to play with the law would be punished. The inspector might not have been against such an outcome in another situation, but there was one small circumstance that he forgot to tell the ruler at the beginning. Namely, the fact that the owner of the garden was a high-born and very young girl who was not even 20 years old, and the usually impenetrable king was overcome with sweat from the realization of what an awkward situation he had found himself in. The rest of the courtiers began to whisper again, discussing what His Majesty would do next. Would he order his first order to be carried out no matter what, or on the contrary, would he order everything to be forgotten immediately and the farm to be ignored from now on? One of the ministers standing nearby raised his hand and respectfully asked whether he should cross out the order of expulsion from the protocol, and the fair-haired sovereign, still feeling terribly awkward, answered in the negative. Trying to regain his composure and serious face, the young ruler cleared his throat and then slowly clarified, was it really true that the owner of Plot 79 was a young girl and not some middle-aged man? Feeling everyone's attention focused on him and beads of cold sweat starting to run down his spine, the inspector replied that yes, and quickly added that Hazel, among other things, was also an aristocrat. The courtiers began to whisper again and discuss what an outrageous scandal it was that a noblewoman of the Great Brotherhood, the white bone of their glorious state, would suddenly stoop to such a low, despicable scam. Then someone asked the department representative what family the main character came from, and upon hearing the name Mayfield, he admitted that he had never heard of it, which meant that the troublemaker could come from a bankrupt family. The fat minister, who had already been shown earlier, angrily declared that even such people should have some idea of pride, because what May was doing was completely outrageous, and Edwina herself had been working calmly all this time, not even suspecting what a storm was raging around her person. In the palace, the blond man on the throne grimaced in irritation and ordered his subordinates to finally shut up. Their angry screams and poisonous whispers caused more discomfort than the buzzing of insects. Flashing his scarlet eyes, like pools of blood, the young ruler replied that this was exactly what the main character wanted, for the powers that be to start paying attention to her, as if she were some kind of princess. To get his message across to everyone, even the most dim-witted, the king officially issued an order. From that moment on, anyone connected to the crown must ignore the new mistress of the 79th section, as if she were an empty space. The courtiers burst into approving cries, like soldiers preparing for battle, but the inspector who had started it all was ready to sink into the ground from the strongest Spanish shame. He could only warn the others about Hazel's harsh temper. However, the older and more senior aristocrat in a monocle only rudely ordered the young man to shut up, since he couldn't cope with even such an elementary task. Then what was there to talk about at all? After this, the elderly nobleman stepped forward to address the king, and the young ruler, of course, immediately pricked up his ears, ready to listen and speak. This man bowed his head before the sovereign in a respectful bow and decisively declared that everything that was happening was his fault, since he had criminally failed to allow the swindler to enter the 79th precinct, but would soon correct this. The blonde-crowned man only nodded dryly, but then mercifully added that the lower-ranking employees were newbies, so it would be logical to expect that they would not be able to cope. And behind their backs, two women in rich clothes, a red-eyed brunette and a blue-eyed blonde, began to whisper in amazement. Was the minister of the Royal Palace Department himself really going to deal with this? But when all the nuances became clear, the nobles decided to move on to a more important issue. A certain flower ball was to take place very soon, and the sovereign urgently needed to decide which woman would become his partner for that evening. The young man answered laconically that his favorite would be a certain Athena, and the mere sound of this name made the old minister feel as if he had a terrible stomachache and a heart attack at the same time. Trying to sound as respectful as possible, the nobleman tried to convince the young king to go with someone other than the duke's daughter this time, but the blonde man replied with a smile, "That won't do. Do you think I'm interested in them?" For a moment, a divine image of his beloved, woven from glass and crystals, seemed to blossom before his eyes. Only Athena evoked warm feelings in the ruler of Britannia, and he planned to propose to her one day. In any case, the young man had no intention of considering any alternatives, and without unnecessary politeness ordered the old man to simply do what he was told. The minister of the department did not answer, but he looked at the young ruler with such a sad expression, as if he had just been spit in the face by his nearest and dearest person. As it turned out a moment later, this was indeed the case. This elderly aristocrat saw the prince being born, rocked him, still a baby, in his arms instead of his father, and mentally swore to do everything possible to protect the prince. But now, when many years had passed and the heir had turned into a ruthless sovereign with an indomitable temper, the aristocrat really wanted to pinch him on the cheek, punishing him for his bad behavior. Slowly wandering towards the exit of the main hall, the head of the department could not believe that his soon-to-be adopted son was actually doing such a stupid thing, and he felt very keenly that he needed a glass of water. All the other courtiers, meanwhile, returned to their favorite pastime, gossip. One of them declared that the swindler had made a good but doomed to fail joke, and another warned that the protagonist was not a predictable person. Looking out the window at the night sky strewn with numerous stars, another aristocrat sadly added that in the future, the luxurious halls of the royal palace could be flooded with blood. He later mentally added that that cruel man had become even more of a nightmare since that day, and Hazel, unaware of the headache she had caused the government, sat down to dinner late that evening with a peaceful face. Another person would have felt oppressed by the small, dark house and the meager rations, but Edwina was so happy and energized after her first work on the land that she noticed nothing of the sort. But before the girl could even bite off a crumb, a very sharp and loud noise suddenly rang out, as if a bear had broken into the very center of the park, and now the beast was trying to get into the house. After a moment's hesitation due to shock, the girl allowed the stranger to enter, and the camera showed viewers that the mysterious visitor was the very same department leader whose face was ominously hidden by a cloud of shadow. His medal, a symbol of status, sparkled in the darkness with a silver light, but Hazel not only did not feel awe, but on the contrary, she began to chew on a cookie with a bored face, and in her mind she quipped, like, "Look at this important gentleman here." In the darkness, due to poor visibility, she mistook the visitor for that same young and rude inspector, and therefore behaved very relaxed. Why be afraid of a fool who had already managed to outplay once? May realized her mistake the moment the minister opened his mouth. He scornfully said, "And this is a farm?" "This is no good," to which Edwina responded with a furious, "What did you say?" Only after this did the main character manage to see the old man's face, pale, tired from hard and thankless work, with deep wrinkles. It evoked very strong associations with a once beautiful but now fading flower. After this, the brunette behaved in a very unexpected way. Instead of talking peacefully or angrily sorting things out, she began to fuss around the visitor like a worried hen, offering cookies and tea. The protagonist dropped the bag of snacks on the floor due to an awkward movement, but the old man reacted in an equally strange way. He jerked in horror and prepared to jump back, as if a vile, poisonous snake had suddenly materialized in front of him. The minister felt an incredible, bone-chilling horror of disgust. Was Hazel really going to live in such a disgusting place? The woman answered carelessly that yes, because this was, after all, her home. And then, as if between the lines, she added that no one could throw her out of here, and the guest should know this. These words almost gave the old man a heart attack. He bit his lip furiously, thinking that this swindler herself did not even understand what a serious crime she had committed, and deserved at least a reprimand for it. However, the elderly nobleman did not have time to say anything. Something completely different caught his attention, forcing him to sharply turn his entire body while the brunette was busy cleaning. A few seconds later, the small garden house almost fell apart from the indignant cries of the aristocrat, "Your mistress is so impudent!" And even the protagonist herself was momentarily taken aback and tore herself away from her cleaning. It turned out that the minister of the royal court department was seriously cursing and shouting at a straw hat hanging on a hook. The old man was scolding it, as if it were a living person, for the fact that its owner was incredibly impudent and dared to use the king himself to make money illegally. Hazel, without batting an eyelid, made a displeased face and repeated that she would not sell her plot, and in general she herself was surprised when she saw a lock on the gate of her property, and the honorable nobleman continued to shower the poor hat with curses. As it turned out a few seconds later, the old man had not gone mad and was not suffering from nightmare vision. He was simply pretending to mistake clothes for a person in order to convey a warning to May that the sovereign had taken action against her. Naturally, Edwina didn't care at all that now no one from the palace could pester her with any accusations or demands. This only made her sincerely happy. Feeling the blood starting to boil in his head, the head of the courtyard department warned the protagonist to finally stop talking nonsense and looking at the world through glasses of an incomprehensible color. Tomorrow she would be thrown out into the street. Here the main character began to lose patience. Trying not to scream at the top of her lungs, she reminded the unpleasant guest that she had all the documents confirming her status. Only after this did the man finally stop playing the fool and start talking to Edwina directly. He ominously warned that there would be a legal investigation, but he would be the one handling the brunette's case. With a sweet smile, this man said that he had lived a long time and knew a lot about legal subtleties, so if necessary, he would find thousands of legal reasons to take away the girl's vegetable garden and throw her out into the street. Only now did the protagonist cast aside her serene attitude and realize that these people really wanted, and most importantly, could cause her a lot of problems. And the old man, meanwhile, with the same cruel smile, began to write something on the sheet of paper. Knowing full well that her future was at stake, Hazel decided to stop the minister at any cost, and she couldn't think of anything better than to grab a dusty piece of cloth and start waving it in the nobleman's direction, causing him to have a severe coughing fit. The aristocrat, gushing tears and snot in the most unsightly manner, screamed at the hat to leave the brunette behind because he suffered from an allergy to dust, and it looked so ridiculous that even the soulless accessory fell into a stupor. Realizing that she had found her enemy's weakness, Hazel began to glow with bloodthirsty self-satisfaction again. After all, now she could bring the enemy to complete incapacitation if it came to an extreme. As for the minister himself, he felt extremely awkward. How could it have happened that a visit to an impudent criminal ended in a dust bombardment? Having no other logical arguments, the nobleman simply shouted angrily, "Be prepared to fly out of here tomorrow," and then ran away, slamming the door. When the courtier ran away in disgrace, the brunette dropped the dusty fabric and looked ahead for several minutes, almost in tears. She could not understand what she should do next. Despite all her outward serenity and self-confidence, she understood perfectly well that she was not living in some kind of comedy manga, where the heroine gets away with any action. Even for what she did to the palace representative, she could have received a very severe punishment. Very slowly, as if under hypnosis, May turned her gaze to the dining table, where a plate of cookies and tea in a mug with rabbit ears stood abandoned and forgotten. Even more slowly, Edwina turned away, hiding her face from the audience. She began to remember how in the distant past, Maz's adoptive mother lured tax collectors into the house with treats and kindness. These people, whom so many hated and despised simply for what they did, were treated with all possible hospitality by the simple farm owner, and sincerely, which could not help but delight Hazel. That was why she had behaved in this way with the minister, in the hope that in this way she would be able to win, if not friendship, then at least just a good attitude, and now she was ready to cry from the realization of failure. Remembering his arrogant, vile behavior, as if he were some kind of celestial being forced to descend into a disgusting barn, the girl thought that she had never given in to her emotions before. In another situation, she would most likely have simply thrown a tantrum in an attempt to release the accumulated stress, and things were clearly heading that way. But suddenly, the protagonist with bulging eyes raised her head as if she remembered something important. As for the head of the department himself, he was still on the street. The old man was shaking off the dust with irritation and muttering to himself that today had been an unusually hard day. He needed to get home as soon as possible and wash off this disgusting substance. The last thing he needed was for him to burst into tears on the street from allergies, like some kind of child. And only after that, the minister noticed with shock that just a few steps ahead of him, there were two guys. One was standing with his mouth open in surprise, and the other was awkwardly pouring a drink on the ground. The one with the drink tried to turn it into a joke, spilling the entire contents of the cup and giving a false smile, but the old man only turned away in irritation and reminded him that he had ordered him not to do such a thing. Then someone called out to the man, and it turned out to be the main character, so the minister thought with even greater irritation and bewilderment what she wanted from him this time. Instead of continuing the main argument, the woman suddenly bombarded the unkind guest with questions about coffee. Was this thing really so unpleasant to him? The nobleman now looked frankly alarmed. He simply did not understand what the hell Hazel wanted from him now, but he assumed that she was looking for his weak points to gain an advantage. As for the coffee specifically, Edwina had really guessed right, and so the elderly aristocrat looked with incredible anger at the two guys, dumbfounded with fear, who had been ordered to keep their mouths shut about this matter. May smiled very happily and broadly because she had guessed correctly, and out loud, in the sweetest voice possible, she invited the head of the department to come visit again. And then she added in an incredibly offended tone that she was incredibly offended by the behavior of the unexpected visitor. How could she even not touch the treat offered by the owner? But never mind. Next time she would make every effort to ensure that the minister ate properly. And after that, the old man looked openly at his opponent, trying to understand whether she had gone crazy. But this is where the strange conversation ended. The king's confidant did not have time to answer, because the protagonist, incredibly quickly for such a skinny woman, ran back. The elderly aristocrat stood there for a long time, looking after the main character, trying to understand what it was. But interestingly, he was seriously considering whether to refuse. Meanwhile, at home, Hazel behaved no less strangely. She ran around the yard and rooms at lightning speed, collecting some ingredients and things. Braiding her hair with a grin, the brunette admitted to herself that her first idea was good, but in this case, a completely different approach was needed. A few more seconds passed, and it turned out that Edwina was getting dressed for another day of work with the earth, despite the fact that it was the middle of the night outside and all people were trying to sleep at that hour. May was determined to prove to herself and those around her at any cost that she was no worse than Aunt Massa. If the latter managed to melt the cold, cruel hearts of government officials, then she could do it too. Despite the late hour, there were plenty of people around. Aristocrats, pages, just random passers-by, but they all sweated at the sight of the protagonist, nervously looked away and whispered to each other about the royal order. Another would have been offended by such behavior, but Edwina only smiled, the way an old fat cat might smile, having filled her belly to the brim with cream left by a careless owner. What happened next would have been called madness by an outside observer without hesitation. Hazel, with her eyes shining with delight, began to rummage through the bushes and trees, looking for something. However, even Edwina's eyes almost popped out of her head when she found a real treasure, whole thickets of beautiful fresh strawberries sparkling like amethysts. While the main character was melting with delight, a small informational footnote made it clear to the audience that on the territory of the royal palace, anyone can eat the fruits of wild bushes and trees. Only those that are fenced and belong to someone are prohibited. Of course, the protagonist didn't think long. Licking her lips greedily, she reached out her hands to the treasured bush, anticipating how much she could do with it. But at the most important moment, she was interrupted by someone's voice. It turned out to be two young aristocrats who were laughingly discussing that the Duchess of Arpes, the cousin of the king himself, was to arrive at the flower ball. One of the high-born girls admitted that she was desperately jealous of Her Highness. In fact, she loved her cousin with all her heart. But if the blonde himself found out about this, he would immediately get rid of the unfortunate relative. Most modern people would be very embarrassed by such incestuous tendencies, but these aristocrats were clearly of a completely different opinion. They almost melted with pleasure, imagining this beauty of forbidden but only sweeter love. And they didn't expect that Arpes would ever tell her cousin what she really felt for him. She was not only divinely beautiful, but also too smart for such nonsense. It was precisely her appearance that the noblewomen envied most of all. Any of them would have given their right arm to be cut off without hesitation in order to have a body like that of this Duchess Athena, even for a day. The very one whom the young monarch was expecting as his partner at the ball. Then one of the gossips suddenly admitted that she would have liked even more that the king, this blonde, handsome man with scarlet eyes, was not an unapproachable ruler, but just a simple knight. Although no, it would be even better if this young man were an ordinary peasant, a disenfranchised serf, looking up at his mistress and patroness with dog-like devotion. While the aristocrats indulged in fantasies, Hazel, sitting just a meter away from them in the bushes, listened attentively to everything. And during this conversation, the name of the young sovereign, Langford, finally became known. Almost anyone else, even someone completely indifferent to politics, would have tried to remember this information, or at least found it interesting. But May was only worried that if she went out and scared these hens, they would crush her strawberries, and even the narration noted that the heroine had nothing but farming on her mind. Luckily for her, just a couple of minutes later, the girls themselves began to leave, and they never noticed how their entire conversation became the property of completely strangers' ears. What happened next was easy to predict. After making sure that there were no more high-born fools nearby, the protagonist collected a full basket of berries in a matter of minutes. Only after the vessel was filled to the brim did Hazel consider the task sufficiently accomplished, and she leisurely made her way to her new garden shed. And if readers decided that after this May would finally calm down and go to bed, then they greatly underestimated her. Now the brunette has decided to do some housework. The main character moved like a crazy ball, constantly jumping and moving at the speed of light from one corner to another. So many tasks she decided to take on herself. The girl continued to smile the whole way, but despite this, it was easy to see how hard it was for her to do all this. Her green eyes were feverishly shining, sweat appeared on her skin, and her hair began to deteriorate, turning into an uncombed mane. The next day the weather was not very friendly, to put it mildly. The sky was covered with huge, impenetrable gray clouds, and at any moment one could expect heavy rain or even a thunderstorm. The minister of the royal household department lay in his bed and tossed and turned, desperately trying to fall asleep, but to no avail. He could not forget the impudent swindler and her crazy behavior. For several minutes, the old man continued his futile struggle for peaceful sleep and rest, before he finally gave in and slowly sat down, quietly cursing at what was happening. To be fair, the nobleman was clearly not the only person in Avalon who had not gotten a good night's sleep that night. The young guard at the gates could not suppress a yawn either. And this was despite the fact that he and his partner were listening to an important order from the aforementioned minister. The old man ordered the guards to go to the park and organize the demolition before it was time to hand over the watch. When the boys saluted with learned gestures and ran to do so, the elderly aristocrat continued his walk, reflecting on how quiet it was in the area now. He stood at a certain door and, before going inside, thought that this was indeed much better. The sooner he could get Hazel out of sight and report this to King Langford, the better. As it turned out, a few seconds later, the head of the department was not going to the sovereign with another report or to his subordinates to give a new assignment, but to Edwina to make a new attempt. She looked at the old man with a very smug grin and said something like this: "Have you forgotten how I warned you that this time you definitely won't be able to refuse my treats?" The old man, maintaining an emotionless expression on his face, nevertheless wondered what the hell had happened that night, and the protagonist, meanwhile, asked him to sit down. The nobleman slowly turned his gaze to the table, where there was a mug of a very aromatic brown drink, and, unable to contain his rage, he shouted, "You nasty girl, you know that I can't drink coffee." But Hazel, with a sunny grin, replied that it wasn't coffee at all. It was easy to read from the man's face what strong but opposing desires were tearing him apart. The courtier remembered that he had come here to fight for a plot of land, but at the same time he wanted to have breakfast. In the end, gluttony proved stronger than duty, and the minister very slowly reached out with a weakly shaking hand for the mug, while the main character watched this with the most sincere interest. As the nobleman took hold of the cup's handle, he stared at the drink for a few more seconds before finally giving in and thinking, "I hope at least this isn't poison." All fears and doubts instantly disappeared as soon as the aristocrat smelled the treat. An invisible and intangible, but very soft warmth seemed to spread through his body, and he thought with light sadness that he did not remember the last time he had even taken coffee. But then the old man opened his eyes in shock when it dawned on him. Hazel had poured him not the standard expensive drink, like those served in the royal palace or the houses of the rich, but the so-called poor man's coffee. The main character, without the slightest embarrassment, admitted that this was indeed the case. She had given her visitor not coffee beans dissolved in boiling water, but a special version that could be made from chicory. This plant is often considered a weed because it can grow almost anywhere and suffocates its neighbors, but it also has some benefits, as the protagonist just demonstrated. The minister, however, was not at all impressed. In fact, he was so outraged that it was as if he had been offered not a tasty herbal drink, but the contents of a chamber pot. But, interestingly, he never burst into indignant cries, as he had originally intended. He could not believe such disrespect, but the aroma of the coffee was very enticing. Finally, the man made up his mind, took a sip, and his consciousness seemed to be carried away into some unknown enchanting worlds. So amazing was the taste of what Hazel had prepared. When the elderly aristocrat asked in a weak voice how this was even possible, the girl explained with a smile that if you first roast the chicory roots and then grind them into powder, the resulting mixture can be used as a good substitute for real coffee. Of course, in most cases, the end result is still a lousy product, but Edwina, without unnecessary modesty, assured the visitor that she knows how to cook vegetation in such a way that the result will be no worse than expensive varieties. Listening to her, the minister seemed to turn into a stone statue. His face was not shown at that moment, but his hand, still clutching the hot mug, no longer trembled or moved at all. But eventually, the nobleman relaxed. No, he didn't smile or try to act friendly with the protagonist, but his pale face still acquired a more natural hue, and his gaze softened. And then he suddenly bit his lips and looked down at the floor, until his face became even paler than before. The nobleman only now realized that he had violated the king's direct order to ignore the new neighbor. Moreover, he violated it directly, and not for the first time, so it's not even possible to write it off as talking to the hat, and the poor old man almost lost consciousness from fear. Luckily for him, Hazel guessed every thought that tormented the gray-haired head of the gloomy guest, and therefore showed him her straw hat, catching a finger to her smiling lips as a sign of silence. Only after this did the head of the department and the king's right hand finally smile at May. In his eyes she still remained a brazen swindler, but now not to the same extent as before. Holding her hat in front of her like a shield, the brunette invited the visitor to sit at the table, and the courtier did not refuse, carefully putting down the mug and sitting down next to her. After a pause, the minister brought the mug to his face and took another sip, but this time not a trial one, but a deep one, so that the drink would penetrate to the very depths and warm the body completely. 1 second, and the nobleman was completely transformed. Instead of a dry, cold-blooded old man, resembling a withering flower, a rosy-cheeked and happy grandfather appeared, enjoying life. He was so pleased that he completely forgot that he was actually obliged to throw Hazel out of the area at any cost and take him for the crown. Instead, the minister good-naturedly admitted that he actually suffered from a real caffeine addiction. And before this had not been a particular problem, on the contrary, it did not matter what disgusting bedlam was happening in the palace, the department leader only needed to take a sip to fully restore his strength and spirit. Of course, this method of dealing with stress did not end well. Soon the man began to drink at least 8 cups a day, and he began to suffer from severe dizziness and nausea. But that, of course, was not all. Much more unpleasant was the fact that soon after this, the nobleman began to have problems with his heart, and insomnia still makes itself felt. The doctor, after listening to the patient's hardships, gave a clear answer. He needed to immediately give up this unhealthy hobby, otherwise the grave was not far off. From that moment on, the darkest and most difficult moments of the aristocrat's life began. Few could imagine how hard it was for him to suffer simultaneously from the idiocy of those around him, problems in his own body, and from the desire to immediately sip at least a drop of coffee. But even that, frankly, paled in comparison to another circumstance, and Hazel was perhaps the only living soul the head of the department dared to tell about it. Somehow, all the other close associates and servants of the king learned about the minister's problems, and from then on, as soon as they saw him, they threw away their portions of the drink with the widest and most hypocritical smiles. They thought that if they were enjoying coffee in front of one of the most powerful men at court, he would look for any excuse to punish them out of hidden envy. But in fact, the old nobleman was hurt by the fact that someone would dare to throw away the wonderful drink for such a trivial reason. When he felt really bad, he still violated the doctor's orders and took 1 sip. After that, the poor fellow suffered terribly from severe pain in his heart and stomach, but he simply could not cope with his desires. But now that the nobleman had tasted Hazel's poor man's coffee, he seemed to have grown 30 years younger. Now he could once again enjoy the familiar, simultaneously tart and sweet taste, and not be afraid of suffering, and even the protagonist blushed with joy after hearing this confession. The main character added that chicory, among other things, is a very useful plant. By consuming it, people improve their health and strengthen their stomachs, the very organ from which the minister is now suffering. As for its association with poverty, unfortunately, the brunette had nothing to say in response. The poor really did start making chicory drinks, desperate to try at least something like the delicacies that the rich enjoyed. The moral of this story is that although chicory had a reputation as a noxious weed, even it could easily be used for the benefit of people, and didn't this make it a real miracle of nature? The courtier's reaction to this information was rather strange. His eyes suddenly lit up, and the old man shouted that now he understood everything, which caused Hazel a slight shock. When she asked what the visitor meant, the man pointed to a frying pan and a set of knives that had been forgotten by the stove. With them, the girl was trying her best to cut the roots and fry them to the desired degree. Moreover, the minister somehow knew that the brunette had been awake all night trying to find the necessary plant, and was even now wasting her energy explaining all the nuances to him. But interestingly, May herself listened to the aristocrat's assumptions almost with horror. Ultimately, the guest came to the conclusion that Edwina had gone to all these lengths to prove to him that agriculture was not some kind of joke, and thus force him to admit that he was wrong. The girl in response only looked at the high-born visitor with great bewilderment and even some disgust. She had never said anything like that before herself. Yes, it was unpleasant for her to hear how the most beloved work of her life was insulted, but Hazel forgot about it after 5 minutes. And then the head of the department grumpily asked what the reason was then. The reason turned out to be incredibly simple and elementary. The elderly gentleman is a guest of the Marinier farm, and moreover, he is its very first guest. That's why Edwina tried to honor him with something tasty, and she never once put any hidden meaning into these actions, like all those blue-blooded schemers. And May, again, had no intention of proving anything to anyone about her hobby. The woman does it because farming gives her incredible delight, and that's all. Of course, the situation was much more complicated, but the main character was even less likely to tell a complete stranger how she grew up on an ordinary farm and was happy there. Having made a sunny, white-toothed smile, the protagonist nevertheless reminded the minister how, not long ago, he came to her with a scandal and threats in an attempt to take away the land. But looking at the man now, Hazel clearly saw that he was happy. And for the first time in a long time, the king's confidant had nothing to say in response to this. The girl, however, did not expect any particular answer. While her interlocutor was collecting his thoughts, she folded her arms across her chest and sincerely apologized for the poor service on the first visit. Back then, May had nothing more complicated than a packet of cookies and a cup of tea, but now she was well prepared and provided the stern courtier with a luxurious, fragrant strawberry pie. The old aristocrat awkwardly looked away, trying to think of a more correct way to convey that he actually didn't like sweets, while the brunette, meanwhile, was almost shoving the pie in his face. The man was trying to decide whether to play along, since they weren't friends after all, but actually enemies. But at the same time, Hazel was looking at him with such affection that she looked more like a hamster than a person. Eventually, the head of the department decided to give in. Having decided for himself that he would try at least a small piece, the nobleman cut off a small portion and chewed it slowly. Just like the last time he tried chicory coffee, the man's eyes lit up and his face turned pink, showing how delicious he found the treat. It was even moderately sweet, just right for him. Playfully licking her lips and wiggling her finger, the protagonist explained that she had not added any sweetener to the dish. It was not necessary, because strawberries naturally contain sufficient amounts of glucose. Then she decides to surprise the guest by telling him that she found this magnificent strawberry right here in the royal park, and before that, no one even wanted to pay attention to the berries. Previously, at the very beginning of their acquaintance, the minister would have only snorted contemptuously. But now, having tasted Edwina's divine dish and drink, he really wanted to know where he could pick more such treasures. The minutes passed like drops of water in a canal. At some point, May offered the visitor more chicory coffee, but the elderly nobleman declined with a polite smile, citing his fullness. The atmosphere in the brunette's house was magical. It was very hard to believe that just a day ago, the aristocrat was ready to use the dirtiest tricks to take away Hazel's patch of land. In a slightly changed voice, the girl said that it was good, now they could talk, to which the minister frowned in bewilderment. Hadn't they done anything but talk before? Fidgeting with her ever-present straw hat, Edwina asked the visitor to listen carefully to her. What was going to be discussed was extremely important, but they might be able to come to an agreement if they discussed it calmly. Naturally, this concerned the ill-fated question of the division of territory. Almost in tears, the once calm woman asked the aristocrat to allow her to explain her claims. The old man said nothing, but his gentle gaze demonstrated his disposition better than any words, and the brunette immediately noted that she did not want to sell her new property. She wanted with all her heart to run a household here. She didn't have time to finish the sentence because the courtier said very quietly, "I know." And in surprise, the girl widened her already huge green eyes and opened her mouth. There was a short pause after that, until the protagonist finally dared to ask again what exactly the minister had just said, and the elderly man looked away with a humble expression, realizing that he would not be able to look the heroine in the face. He knew that if he stayed too long, he would look too stupid, and so after a few seconds he carelessly declared that he had stayed too long and it was time to call it a day. But Hazel, of course, was not going to let the nobleman go so easily. No, not to end a painful argument, but to give the head of the royal palace department a variety of gifts, as if he were a young man and she a grandmother worried about his health. Immediately, a small detachment of guardsmen, who had previously been given the order to carry out the demolition, ran up to the old man, and for the first time, they called out the title and name of this character, Count Albert. Remembering that he had indeed given such a command, being confident that he would soon get rid of the swindler, the nobleman thought for a moment and quietly replied that the order was no longer relevant, and then the audience was transported to a luxurious room filled with books and models. It was one of the offices in the royal palace, and in addition to the department leader, there was a young inspector who had first tried to kick Hazel out. Now the young man was almost bleeding bile, fully aware that the boss had secretly violated the king's order. The guy was also very puzzled by Albert's atypical behavior. He was smiling and beaming, as if he had recently secretly taken coffee. But the entire court knew perfectly well that the Count could not drink his favorite drink due to serious stomach problems. It all seemed like some kind of absurd fairy tale picture. And when His Highness began to joyfully mutter to himself, "Wonderful, simply wonderful," His young subordinate felt his jaw come off his head and fall with a crash to the floor. Coming to his senses, the young official, his eyes shining with hope, asked whether it was his report that Albert was praising with such pleasure, but the Count mercilessly dashed the boy's hopes, answering that he was remembering that strawberry pie. Taking a closer look at the boss's table, the young inspector was shocked to see that there, on the plate, was a piece of sweet strawberry pie, and the senior nobleman was gobbling it up with great pleasure and without embarrassment in front of anyone. Feeling the situation becoming more and more absurd with each passing second, the blonde still couldn't resist asking about the treat, and the old man simply replied that he was eating wild strawberry pie. As it turned out, none of them had previously known that a large number of such delicacies were growing nearby. They were too busy working in the palace to take a proper look at the ground and plants. Albert notes with interest that yes, this is logical since she has never been to court before, and when his subordinate asks if he is talking about berries, he answers with unexpected anger that he is thinking about that interesting person. His reaction, however, was understandable. He had deliberately made the hints as thick and obvious as possible, so how stupid would you have to be to not see through them? The head of the department began to mercilessly scold his intern, as if he were a wayward grandson, but at the very last moment he made an effort and instead decided to gently scold the young man, and at the same time praise him for his other qualities. The young man, of course, completely softened in the first moments, but then he stared at his boss with almost superstitious horror. Albert had never spoken to him in such a tone before. In addition, the old courtier ordered that all remaining plans for the day be cancelled because he was going to devote the rest of the evening to studying some book. The Count had read it many times before, but today was a special occasion. For some time the nobleman carefully read the faded letters on the old paper, turning some thought over in his head before saying with satisfaction, "Ah, so that's it." Looking out the large open window at the blue skies, the minister of the Royal Palace Department remarked meaningfully that a fresh wind must be blowing here soon. Some time passed, and Hazel, getting ready to go work with the first seedlings, was surprised to find a letter with a blue seal on the threshold of her porch. The sender was, of course, the old Count Lysander Albert, and as the recipient's name he simply wrote "straw hat," and even the protagonist commented on how strange it was. In the letter, the old man apologized for his more than ugly behavior, and for the fact that Langford had issued this stupid law about ignoring Edwina. He had inadvertently made the brunette a scapegoat in front of the entire court, but May, characteristically, treated this with understanding. She had had an unpleasant experience with the old boss. With interest, she began to read the letter further, turning over page after page, until at one point she came across a very strange message. It made the girl first freeze with her mouth open and then scream in shock throughout the entire area. 5 minutes passed, and the two women from the palace, trying in horror not to look at Hazel, reminded each other of the royal decree until the brunette in the sweetest tone asked to just look at the letter. After examining the message with some doubt, the officials acknowledged that under normal circumstances, no private property could be located on the palace grounds. But there could be exceptions. As it turned out, one of the previous kings was quite the voluptuary, and in order to have the opportunity to admire female beauty up close, he officially allowed beauty salons to be organized at the palace, and this strange, even absurd law was still formally in effect. The courtiers looked at each other awkwardly, unable to understand how they should react to this, and the protagonist, not without malice, replied that all suggestions and complaints could be expressed to her straw hat. She was incredibly grateful to Mr. Albert, who found a way to protect her from any further encroachments of the king or his henchmen, and Langford himself, meanwhile, was awakened by an unusual aroma. As is well known, the days of important politicians, including kings, are scheduled literally down to the minute, and the ruler of Britannia was no exception. While they were dressing him, the blonde thought with longing that the serene morning silence was sweeter to him than any music. Unfortunately, all the beauty of the moment was mercilessly destroyed by a strange smell, although no, it wasn't even a smell, but a monstrous, unbearable stench, as if some idiot had dug up a colossal cattle burial ground next to the palace or spilled a huge tub of shit. With his expression almost unchanged thanks to the endurance he had acquired over many years, Langford took a special bell and rang it, and a worried servant immediately came running to the noise. As it turned out, the stench came from fertilizers, and the young monarch, oddly enough, realized this himself right away, but he could not understand why they smelled like sewage, as if a sewer had burst somewhere nearby. The unfortunate servant hesitated, mumbled, not knowing what to answer to something like that, and the ruler meanwhile began to openly lose patience. He didn't care about the reasons and details, just why did the stench reach even his room? The chamberlain must have begun to faint with horror, imagining himself being sentenced to the rack for his lack of information, but fortunately for him, Langford was thinking about something else entirely: his recent decree. Then the king looked at the park and realized with shock that all the construction beams had disappeared, despite the fact that he had given the order to begin large-scale construction. And when the man learned that it was the guards who had removed them, he was almost speechless. Having regained control of his body and tongue, the red-eyed youth asked whether the minister in charge of the Department of Internal Affairs was currently in the palace, and the servant, sweating profusely, mumbled that yes. Then, as if on command, Lysander Albert himself appeared, but not with the usual sour expression on his pale face and in black clothes, but with an inspired, shining face and in a sky-blue jacket. Langford asked irritably what the hell was going on, and the Count replied with a good-natured smile that he too had been very surprised when they began to build a salon for women just a few meters from the palace. The blonde blinked in confusion, and the minister explained that yes, 200 years ago, Emperor Ramstein II had officially issued a decree allowing such establishments to be built right on government territory. This was the only exception to the rule, but a very remarkable one. Thanks to the whim of the ancient ruler, the hostesses of the salon could not only act freely on the territory of the palace, but also had absolute power in their establishments, as if they were queens. Trying to smooth things over and prevent the young monarch from exploding with anger, Albert hastened to explain that this was based on accepted practice everywhere, and in general, he personally did not like it at all. The fact remained, however, that if some wily noblewoman managed to open a salon, she could not be thrown out even with royal power, and poor Langford almost dropped his jaw to the ground when he heard this. To avoid suspicion, Rysard very realistically feigned sorrow. He took out a handkerchief, dabbed his absolutely dry eyes with it, and whined something like, "Forgive me, Your Majesty. Even the best professionals can be caught off guard." In response, the blonde gave the Count a very intent look, and his expression was so unreadable that it was unlikely that anyone would be able to tell what the young man wanted most: to throw Albert down from the balcony or simply exclaim, "Are you kidding me?" Finally, Langford asked in a very cold and hard tone if the loyal minister was hiding something from him, and Lysander's eyes darted suspiciously. The head of the department finally tried to explain, but he didn't have time. A cloud of black smoke seemed to come from the blonde, symbolizing his hidden rage, and the Count realized that the threat of falling head first onto the pavement was closer than ever. A few minutes pass, and the audience is shown how the young king, with a stony face, grabs a battle bow and then slowly pulls the bowstring, preparing to release an arrow into the distance. The chamberlain screamed in hysterical horror, begging His Majesty to calm down and not take sin on his soul. But Langford responded in an inhuman voice that the status of his state had just collapsed, leveling itself with the ground. Another voice respectfully but firmly asked the fair-haired king to curb his anger, because the laws, among other things, forbade anyone from hunting on the palace grounds, as if they were animals or people. And in doing so, he was trying to save Hazel from getting another hole in her body. However, the sovereign still fired the arrow, either from the anger that overwhelmed him, or from awkwardness, and the deadly projectile whistled past a few centimeters from the girl's head, tearing to shreds the bag that she was carrying. It all happened so suddenly and quickly that for a few seconds the main character mechanically continued to smile and hum a song, before widening her eyes in horror and screaming, "What? Langford quietly noted to himself that he hadn't really planned to kill Edwina. He was only going to show her that kings weren't to be trifled with, and the assembled servants widened their eyes in shock, wondering how it was possible to hit the target so accurately from such a long distance. But very soon, the small moral victory crumbled into ashes. May was sincerely happy, looking at the scattered manure, because she would never have been able to tear this tight bag on her own. Hearing this, the red-eyed youth froze, and his face distorted with a false smile. Only his royal upbringing prevented him from bursting into disgusting swearing for the entire district to hear. One of the servants called out to His Majesty very timidly, holding out some paper, and Langford, looking at it, darkened his face, and his lips twisted into a half-mad grin. There were only 3 short words: "The conqueror king is conquered," and then the focus shifted to some red-haired and fanged woman. She was laughing out loud, unable to even stand up straight. Looking at this, the golden-haired sovereign only covered his face with his hand and muttered in a doomed tone that, yes, of course, if she had even a microscopic opportunity to make a fool out of him, she would use it. As it turned out, it was not a woman, but simply a very effeminate man, and he, wiping away the tears that had appeared, asked the bishop not to be angry, since everything had gone exactly as planned anyway. Not long ago, there was a dialogue between them, where Langford expressed a desire to become closer to the people, and the red-haired one advised him to keep it simple, but now he noted with a laugh that the young king constantly had such an expression on his face as if he urgently needed the help of a psychiatrist. Out of helplessness and anger, the young sovereign suddenly behaved like a small, capricious child. He waved his fists, cried, shouting that everything was wrong, pouted, and his interlocutor, meanwhile, mercilessly continued, "What kind of closeness can we talk about if the sovereign arbitrarily takes away other people's possessions?" Here, 2 more courtiers finally intervened in the conversation, a beautiful elf with long hair and a young beastman with cat ears. They advised the ruler to simply forget about the swindler anyway; she would soon run away on her own. The beastman also added that the decree to ignore was a good decision, and anyway there was no point in worrying about what was written in the newspapers. The public had a short memory and immediately forgot what they had read for the sake of new articles. And then he mentioned the house by the garden, where Hazel now lived. From the outside it might seem normal, but in fact the building was on its last legs. It even had a huge hole in the roof, which the girl had recently patched up. The young beastman was so excited, proving his case to his comrades, that he did not immediately notice how, in his emotions, he clenched his clawed fingers too tightly, and as a result, tore off a decent piece of bark from a young tree. When the half-human realized what he had done, the fur on his tail stood on end in horror. The red-haired nobleman, meanwhile, laughed again, and the elf coldly noted, "This pathetic general has messed up again. It's better to transplant the tree." The beast-man, feeling extremely awkward and guilty, quietly asked for forgiveness for what he had done, and added that if he got carried away playing, he might cause some kind of trouble. The elf, squatting down near the tree and affectionately stroking its trunk, demanded that his colleague immediately apologize to the commander, meaning the plant, and the catman really began to ask forgiveness from the tree, as if it were a rational being. While they continued to fool around, a very tall, broad-shouldered brunette in dark purple robes quietly approached Langford, who was watching all this from the side. He quietly gave the emperor a thumbs up in approval, and then somehow managed to convey the following message without opening his mouth. "Ruling is hard, but adversity makes us stronger, and I'll buy you a drink later." Then this man joined the rest of the king's friends. They all now sat in front of the tree and stroked it with their hands, as if it were a huge, very fat and cute cat. The golden-haired youth watched them fooling around for a while longer, after which he slowly wandered away. However, he, albeit with difficulty, still admitted that he himself had behaved like a complete fool. Langford's retinue, in turn, watched him go for a long time. They said nothing, but in their eyes one could easily read the hidden pride for the maturing overlord. And then they all started to scold Louis, the red-haired and effeminate courtier, claiming that he had been excessively rude to the young monarch, and the red-haired one meekly admitted that, yes, he was a brute. But on the other hand, at least he was honest. When there was a reason to laugh at Langford's stupidities and mistakes, Louis thereby made them obvious, and did not cowardly lament, everything will be fine, like some sycophants. Someone else might have been impressed by such a speech, but the beast cat, looking up at his comrade, only asked in bewilderment what the hell he was talking about. Then the man simply admitted that he loved to mock the young, proud, and suspicious king, precisely because of how sensitive he was to any ridicule. As for the elf and the other advisors, the red-haired man called them all stupid, as if this was not a conversation between grown men governing a great country, but an argument between children. To get his point across, Louis gave them a very interesting comparison. Imagine that a man returns to his room and sees a piece of fresh shit in the very center. The person naturally gets angry and doesn't quite understand what to do with it. He turns to those around him for advice, but they all just repeat, "Don't touch the shit, and it will resolve itself." But even if that was the case, the question remained, why the hell should the poor guy have to endure the stench from him? And now the red-haired trickster could finally explain to those around him the essence of his idea. A whole squad of faceless figures wearing identical dark suits and hooded cloaks appeared out of nowhere in front of the man as he continued his speech. "I, Luis Gallardo, am the only one who will help my friend in trouble." All playfulness, any hint of mischief instantly disappeared from his appearance. Releasing vampire fangs from under his lip, the guy promised to show Hazel how stupid she had acted, deciding to break into the palace and make a fool out of Langford. Meanwhile, the main character's life was not exactly a bed of roses. A huge hole had once again appeared in the ceiling, and the unfortunate girl was almost in tears, trying to patch it up. But then, like a brave pioneer, she ordered herself not to give in. Any difficulties can be successfully resolved. You just need to put in enough effort. Carefully descending the stairs, the protagonist was thinking about how best to replace the damaged parts when another step suddenly broke, turning the stairs into junk. The brunette very slowly looked away, then just as slowly opened her mouth, and only the gods know what effort it took her to refrain from screaming at the top of her lungs. Several minutes passed, and now Edwina, almost in tears, was trying with all her might to nail the broken step back, but it turned out to be surprisingly difficult. Hazel gave up very quickly, sprawling on her back on the grass, sadly admitting that she was too weak to drive a nail into anything hard, and it was lunchtime. She felt like the most miserable person in the whole wide world. The poor thing had been dragging heavy bags of fertilizer to the garden from morning until noon, and had worked so hard that she was ready to suck her paw from hunger. The protagonist was also very depressed by the fact that people from the palace came to her all day long. They did not talk, remembering the king's prohibition, but because of the smell of manure they looked at May with such anger and contempt that the latter felt cold in her body. But as if on command from the remote control, Edwina instantly switched to a more positive way of thinking. In particular, she was once again glad that the arrow shot by some kind person tore that bag. Speaking of the arrow, Hazel had, of course, picked it up and was now seriously considering turning this beautiful weapon of war made of solid wood and stainless steel into kitchenware. Langford himself, meanwhile, continued to watch the protagonist's every step closely, like a child whose parents brought him to the zoo for the first time. He was thinking about the fact that he had been right from the start. This swindler, like a bunch of her predecessors, had a strong character that did not allow her to be scared so easily, while May herself, with her eyes shining with delight, went to dig potatoes. The golden-haired autocrat thought with despondency that not only had he wasted a valuable combat shell, but also that Louis, if he found out the details, would start making fun of him once again. In addition, Albert and all the other high courtiers had left, leaving the master all alone. And at this moment, Langford resembled not a cunning warlord king, but a frustrated and lost child. Then the blonde remembered that if the Beastman Kane said that, Edwina's house was actually gradually falling apart, so there was no need to worry, the problem would soon resolve itself. At this thought, the young man could not help but smile. Ah, how nice it would be if it would rain and just kill the damn girl, while Hazel herself, meanwhile, lovingly examined the potatoes. After some thought, the brunette decided to turn the tubers into a large, cake-like dish with cheese and herbs, and then open the cider and thus celebrate her first full meal in the new place. But this was not enough to make the holiday completely sweet. The main character decided to make a dessert, and immediately ran to collect various ingredients. She naturally crossed the border of the palace grounds and walked through the crowd of aristocrats, who rewarded the uninvited guest with frightened glances, but still said nothing. At some point, the protagonist stopped in shock because she realized that opposite the fountain that she had passed a few days ago, a small but full-fledged forest had been growing all this time. She stared in surprise and shock at what she saw, and it was, of course, not some kind of miserable gold or a scattering of useless gems, but real, fresh, and juicy May apples. The author's footnote helpfully explained that this is a variety of apple that is always green, which is why many people mistakenly think that it is sour and disgusting to taste. But in fact, these fruits just need to be cooked correctly. While the happy Hazel, who had forgotten about everything in the world, was thinking about how best to process such a wonderful find, the door to her house opened with a barely audible rustle, letting in a man in black. More precisely, people, a whole crowd of silent figures wrapped in identical outfits with cloaks and hoods instead of hats, froze in front of a frightened, frozen girl. The protagonist's shock was so strong that she relaxed her fingers, allowing the knife for cutting fruits and vegetables to slide onto the table. It certainly did not occur to her at that moment that it would be better to keep the weapon on her person. But the most interesting thing was not even this, but the fact that Hazel May actually recognized these visitors of hers. It was hard not to recognize them by these crimson capes on the inside, their identical and emotionless pale faces. And, of course, the eyes. Each of the silent visitors had unnatural, blood-red eyes with a narrow horizontal pupil, like a crocodile or a snake. May looked at these monsters with real, undisguised horror, and this was a very alarming call, considering that before this she treated almost everything either as a joke or as an annoying obstacle. These were the Knights of the Order of the Sacred Flame, which was led by Luis Gallardo, one of Langford's closest assistants, and the brunette, coming to her senses, very slowly sank to her knees and reached out with her hand for the missing knife. Taking the blade, the protagonist straightened up just as slowly and asked in a trembling voice what the creepy guests wanted from her. They, unlike the glutton Albert, certainly couldn't be tempted with coffee and pie. The cloaked knights had not yet said anything, but fortunately they were not trying to attack either. They continued to stand and only periodically moved their heads, looking around the room with an emotionless gaze. This went on for several very unpleasant seconds for the main character, and then the red-eyed warriors, without saying a word, moved towards her, forcing her to recoil in horror. They surrounded the young farmer from all sides like wolves cornering a deer, and only now did Hazel understand what these monsters wanted from her. Gods behold, the main character was incredibly nervous. She must have never been so afraid in her life, but May tried her best not to show it, so she returned to cutting the apple with exaggerated indifference, and reminded that she officially owned a salon, not a farm. The sinister warriors remained deathly silent this time as well, and as Edwina continued to work her knife steadily, she realized that for some reason she felt extremely depressed simply by the fact of her existence. It was very similar to some kind of witchcraft spell that vampires and other evil spirits cast on their victims in fairy tales, so the protagonist, gathering her will into a fist, forced herself to ignore it and concentrate on work. Cooking a potato dish should have been a joyful event, filled with warmth and pleasure from the realization of the work done, but because of this silent crowd, all the bright emotions fell into the ice hole. As it turned out, 2 hours had already passed, and all this time the knights in capes continued to stand like pillars and silently, but very carefully watched every action of the victim, quietly bringing her to hysteria. Worse, they followed Hazel around even when she went out to do her next job in the garden, and now the poor thing really understood what it was like to be cornered by a hare. The alarming silence was finally broken by a loud, very ordinary sound, the rumbling of a stomach that had not received nourishment from the body for a very long time and was indignantly signaling this. None of the visitors spoke, not even the muscles on their faces twitched, but May immediately realized that one of them was quite hungry, and considering that everyone present was teenagers, this was even expected. And that was enough for Hazel's bone-chilling, chthonic horror of government assassins to instantly recede. Her caring mother mode was activated again. Meanwhile, the leader of the Knights of the Holy Flame, Luis Gallardo, was discussing something with someone in the depths of the castle. Their conversation was very quiet and indistinct, so even a seasoned spy would hardly be able to make out the words from the outside. Eventually, the interlocutor finished his speech, and the red-haired man stared at him with genuine disbelief, as if instead of an important report he had been told an absurd joke. That's essentially how it was. One of the lower-ranking knights couldn't think of anything better than to declare in all seriousness that their squad had failed the mission and had fallen for the tricks of the swindler because a voice from space had ordered them to eat the food she had prepared. With eyes shining with delight, several teenagers described how amazing all these dishes were, and they did not even think about fearing the deserved punishment from the boss. Luckily for them, Louis was more thoughtful. In his thoughts, he finally confirmed that the warriors of the Order of Flame were vampires, but they usually restrained their thirst for blood. On the other hand, the ghouls of this universe can eat human food, so Gallardo was not at all surprised that his subordinates fell into the same trap as Count Albert once did, unable to cope with the call of their stomach. What the head vampire couldn't understand was why the hell Hazel even decided to invite a crowd of bloodsuckers to her table, and now he very seriously demanded an account of what his subordinates had eaten. One of the young warriors, awkwardly rubbing the back of his head, admitted that none of them had a clue. From their point of view, Edwina simply got a piece of earth, fried it, then cut up the wood, and served it all to the visitors. The red-haired grandmaster blinked in bewilderment. How was this even possible? Could the protagonist really be not only a malicious swindler, but also a witch? Then another knight spoke up, admitting that he had no idea what piece of earth was being talked about, but that the wood was in fact ordinary roasted meat. On the other hand, none of them could deny that the food in that house had an unnatural, almost enchanting aroma, and now they clearly felt stupid about it. Gallardo, however, understood it in his own way. In his eyes, Hazel had finally turned into a dangerous and cunning sorceress, and now God knows what she was doing with the second squad sent to replace the first. His subordinates agreed that Edwina really needed to be stopped as soon as possible. After all, if you ate even a piece from her hands, it would be a one-way ticket. Feeling like a victim of some large-scale and protracted theater of the absurd, Louis slapped the tabletop sternly and warned that it would be better to focus on punishing the lousy witch from now on. The subordinates readily saluted, but as soon as the commander left the door, they again melted into puddles of pleasure, savoring the memories of the incredible, divine food and dreaming of trying it again. A little later, a bewildered Gallardo reflected on what he had expected to see as a hellish bacchanalia, with people everywhere who had gone mad, overfed and drunk to death, and demons serving them. However, in practice, the main character's house turned out to be suspiciously quiet. No hint of traces of devilish sacrifices, black magic practices, or even debauchery. Here Louis's gaze fell upon a large dish cooling on the board, reminiscent of a cake in the shape of a bud, and the vampire immediately assumed that this was another of Edwina's creations. The red-haired youth seriously thought about what he should do with all this. Of course, on the one hand, if this was that sinister, bewitching food, then he had to be careful. On the other hand, the temptation of the forbidden fruit was too strong, so Gallardo, forgetting about any doubts and possible dangers, sent a piece into his mouth. Having tasted it properly, the knight almost burst into tears with pleasure, and he immediately reached for a larger piece, explaining to himself that it was necessary to properly study the enchanted food. Having chewed this part, Louis felt his whole body filled with unearthly grace, and it was as if wings had grown behind his back. It was so delicious. It was unlike any other food the royal assistant had ever tasted before. The ingredients, the spices, the degree of preparation, everything was selected and made perfectly. Why, even the royal chefs, who spend years learning to cook as luxuriously as possible, would seem like pathetic losers compared to Hazel and her divine dish. Now Gallardo truly understood why his subordinates described and savored the memories of the swindler's dishes with such vivid delight. He, being an aristocrat, was used to not paying attention to the taste of food, but simply quickly taking it, chewing and swallowing it in order to return to more important matters. But now, when Louis could afford to simply eat a wonderful dessert for the first time in a very long time, without waiting for poison or the start of another meeting, he was ready to kiss Edwina's feet. if only she would share the secret. And then, unnoticed by anyone, Hazel crept up behind the visitor, held out a mug of coffee, and asked if the nobleman would like to try another drink. And it happened so suddenly that the red-haired vampire froze like a pillar of salt. Naturally, a second later, the poor guy was truly horrified by how unexpected and sudden it all happened, while May just giggled at her joke. Having caught his breath a little, the man tried to understand how the protagonist had managed to get to him so quietly and quickly, while the brunette sullenly thought that she should have said hello. Then she smiled and handed him the coffee, and again offered to drink it, jokingly threatening to make Louis famous as a thief of other people's food if he didn't. Gallardo, who had recently been confident and dignified, could now only look at the mug with a pained expression on his face, like a child who had been offered an incredibly delicious candy by an unfamiliar and dangerous man. Naturally, the young man could not resist, and having drunk the coffee, he admitted to himself that now he would do anything just to gobble up the rest of the dessert. The drink made his hunger even worse. There was still a small problem here. Galliard's upbringing did not allow him to simply grab and eat the dish, and he could not ask politely because of the infamous law on ignoring. Tormented by thirst and unable to satisfy it, the vampire, perhaps for the first time in his life, thought of his king with real hostility. For how could anyone come up with such a stupid decree? What followed was something like a performance of the theater of the absurd. Louis bent over, hissed, opened and closed his mouth, unable to bring himself to touch the tart, and Hazel looked on with the air of a smiling mannequin. It all ended, as in the case of Count Albert, with conversations with a straw hat, portraying someone like a maid working for a cunning swindler. And Gallardo, still suffering from hunger, accepted the rules of this strange game with pleasure, like a child who has just been introduced to a completely new entertainment. And the first thing Louis did, awkwardly rubbing his head and blushing, was to apologize for trespassing on someone else's property and eating a good chunk of the dish without permission. As he honestly admitted, he initially planned to try just one very small piece, but the taste of the dessert turned out to be so fantastic that his appetite overshadowed his mind. But Hazel, of course, was only glad. Like any housewife, she felt great pleasure when her food was found tasty and would readily feed it to anyone who wanted it. Enjoying another portion of the treat, Gallardo enthusiastically asked the hat how its owner had even learned to cook like that, because it was something incredible. And then Louis, like the same little child, declared in a capricious tone that all desserts should be tasty, that is, sweet, and if even one of them turned out to be sour, the vampire might get angry. However, with Edwina's tart, everything was different. It was made from May apples, sourish, but somehow it still caused incredible delight and euphoria in the head of the knightly order. The red-haired guest's enthusiasm was so strong that even Hazel herself felt a little awkward. Hiding her face behind her hat, she replied that she had baked a treat from wild fruits. May, with her sincere love for everything that grows on earth, added that May apples would be very pleased to hear that someone found them tasty, because these poor things don't even have a proper name. As for the specific place where they grew, the protagonist discovered several trees at once not far from a large statue of a lion, and Gallardo was genuinely surprised to hear such a banal answer. Realizing that the aristocrat knew nothing, the girl launched into an explanation. This, so to speak, variety of apples looks green even when ripe, and in May they fall very quickly, and many people ignore them, taking them for unripe rubbish. However, this primarily concerned city dwellers and arrogant aristocrats, but the situation is different with wise and practical farmers who always know how to find a good use for even the most inconspicuous at first glance objects. In response, Louis measured the protagonist with a very thoughtful, intent, and at the same time slightly moist look. At that moment, the red-haired vampire, one of King Langford's confidants and the head of an entire order of knights, looked even more like a baby to whom a wise mother was telling something unusual about the world around him. Gesturing and shining with every pore of her skin, the brunette explained that farmers, like their distant primate ancestors, always strive to try an unfamiliar object with their teeth, and even if they come across inedible crap, they will continue to search for ingredients. In the case of apples, everything was very simple. Just dip them in boiling water several times and hold them until the pulp becomes almost transparent, after which you can calmly enjoy their taste. After hearing all this, Louis suddenly clenched his fist and shouted that apple tart was food for real men, and he would now refer to it that way as a sign of respect for the unbending spirit of gardeners. Then Gallardo suddenly showed off his own culinary inventive streak, wanting to use the same applesauce with vanilla ice cream and milk bread, for example. And if someone were to add this processed juice to regular soda, they would get a first-class cooling drink that could help out even in the most terrible heat. And of course, cookies. There were so many cool things you could do with them too. And Hazel listened to this stream of creativity with such enthusiasm that her braids fluttered like wings or tails. The brunette was very surprised that this vampire liked desserts so much, especially sweet ones. And for a moment she forgot that they had no right to talk, until she came to her senses and hid her face behind her hat. And then it turned out that Louis, like Albert, had a complex, even partly tragic story connected with his favorite dish, which the red-haired leader of the Knights was now going to tell. The action moves back many years to the past, when Gallardo was still only a teenager and a novice, but even then he demonstrated excellent skills in wielding a sword, always defeating his peers in duels. Those around her were very envious of this, and as soon as they found out that this red-haired beast had quite a sweet tooth, they decided to get even by telling the secret to the entire palace. Like crazy and cruel hyenas, they made fun of the young Gallardo for the fact that she was actually a girl who had been hiding her true gender all this time, but had been caught out by her love for sweets, which is what stereotypes attribute to women. This left a noticeable scar on Louis's psyche, and from then on she chose to pretend to hate foods that contained a lot of sugar, even after she became a great warrior, the head of a fearsome order, and a close aide to the king of the Britannia. Hazel, however, was much more embarrassed not by this tragic tale, but by the fact that she had been talking to a woman all this time. And now Gallardo's mouth dropped open in shock, realizing the scale of the embarrassment. This awkward moment lasted for several long seconds, but the red-haired vampire managed to come out of it surprisingly beautifully. She rose to her feet, saluted as if before a commander, and then stated her name, age, and gender. And then it turned out that the protagonist really didn't know who exactly had decided to visit her abode this time. Even in her wildest dreams, it never occurred to her that she would one day see such a heroine. The name Louis was so well known that even in the exams for entering the bank service it appeared in some places. But for the swordswoman herself, this caused more embarrassment than pride. Then the main character admitted that there were interesting rumors among the people that one of His Majesty's closest associates was actually a girl pretending to be a male knight. Now Hazel was jumping and screaming with joy at seeing a legend in the flesh, and Gallardo, feeling increasingly Spanish shame, admitted that she had gone against the wishes of her own family when she decided to pretend to be a boy for the sake of service. However, she hastened to assure him that there was no need to think of her as some kind of boor. In fact, the vampire would have been much happier if Edwina had seen her as a sworn older sister who simply knew how to fence. In response, May moved her hat much closer to the warrior's face, and pretending that she had not heard anything, asked again, So, respected guest, are you really ready to become the older sister for this hat?" The red-haired woman hesitantly replied that it wouldn't be easy, and the protagonist, hiding behind her headdress, grinned very smugly, for she was glad to meet a person who didn't give a damn about the boycott law. Meanwhile, Gallardo herself began to look at the brunette with sincere admiration. She began to see in her an incredibly strong personality, although this was even expected, because only an extraordinary mind would dare to set up a farm next to the royal castle. And then another very awkward moment came, because the two women only now noticed the second squad of Knights of the Sacred Flame, and they looked at the leader with shock. Louise was so ashamed that she wanted to sink into the ground. She had stupidly spilled one of her deepest secrets to completely strangers, not to mention setting a bad example for her subordinates in terms of breaking the king's rules. But what made Gallardo even worse was the realization that she would never again be able to scold her soldiers for accepting Hazel's bribe, because she had done the same thing herself, and now others knew about it. Mumbling that the main character's food really does bring disaster, the red-haired girl ran away without any ceremony, only managing to shout "sorry" to her new younger sister. The protagonist was very upset by the vampire's escape because she was a real genius at tasting, and May still had a huge number of dishes to try. On the other hand, she admitted that Edwina's food was a disaster, that is, it was incredibly tasty, and its creator was a goddess, and this made the brunette even happier and more pleased with herself. So gradually the day ended, giving way to evening. The first stars had already begun to shine in the crimson skies, but the night was still in no hurry to come into its own. And then the focus shifted to another member of Langford's inner circle, the long-haired elf who had recently forced his fellow beastman to apologize to a scratched tree. There were other members of the team there too, but they were not discussing important state affairs, but on the contrary, were taking a break from this tiresome routine over a simple game of cards. The only one who was in no hurry to join in the general fun was Luis Gallardo. Lying on the couch and thoughtfully looking at the ceiling, she continued to remember what happened in Hazel's house. Having barely heard her whisper about how fresh and nice it was there, the others pounced on the redhead in shock, screaming, "What? Were you going there?" And the girl, in horror, assured them that everything was completely wrong, that her friends had simply thought wrong. As it turned out, the other knights, commanders, and officials thought that the vampire had broken loose and attacked some man, but fortunately, this turned out to be completely wrong. Gallardo tried to explain what exactly had happened to her today, but she fell silent, unable to finish her sentence, and the cat-like youth, losing patience, finally demanded that she finish. But then he himself figured out where the problem lay. Rumors quickly began to spread around the palace that a large shipment of apple tarts had arrived from the forbidden 79th precinct, and some people had managed to stuff their bellies with them to their heart's content. The Beastmen had been investigating these rumors for some time, trying to figure out what was behind them, but now he realized who the patient zero was that started this craze. After that, the elf measured the cold and sweaty from Fear Louis with an icy gaze and in an emotionless tone began to scold her. Like, who is this fool who secretly went to the swindler in violation of all the rules and who just recently bragged that he would quickly solve the problem? A real contempt appeared in the green eyes of the pointy-eared man. Gallardo was so brave, bragged so much about how she could instantly get rid of May, and in the end what? She just went to visit and sat down for tea with buns? After some time, when almost all the nobles had left the room, only the vampire remained, and she was horrified and lamented that her colleagues had now completely lost respect for her. Then Louis tried her best to convince her comrades that there was absolutely no point in being angry at Hazel. She was not some kind of swindler, but an incredibly kind soul, alive and the sweetest piece of tart. But this only made things worse, because the men began to think that the warrior was incredibly corrupt, since she was now ready to wag her tail in front of a man she saw for the first time in her life, and only because of food. To the elf's credit, he wasn't so wicked as to say this to Gallardo's face. Instead, he tactfully pointed out that the woman was making a mistake in equating the stranger's culinary skills with her moral character. And then the long-haired man asked a question that made the vampiress think for a long time. If Edwina really was such a holy person, would she shamelessly use a loophole in the law? In this world, there was an idiom very similar to the earthly expression, a wolf in sheep's clothing, a fox in a sheep's clothing, an epithet awarded to ruthless swindlers who used loopholes in the laws for their own gain. And now Louis seriously wondered, was Hazel really one of those brats, and that the elf was completely right in his accusatory speech? However, the instincts honed over years of military service persistently told the red-haired hostess that in reality everything was not as it might seem from the outside. It turned out that Count Albert was enjoying his coffee nearby with a blissful expression on his face, and it dawned on the vampire, what if this whole idea with the salon was born not in May's head, but in someone else's? This was, in fact, an extremely obvious option. This ridiculous law had been forgotten by almost everyone, and only an extremely meticulous lawyer would be able to dig up this antiquity, and the old man in the palace was the only suitable candidate. Finally, Gallardo's inhuman sense of smell caught the specific smell of the Mariniere farm from Rysander's drink, and this was enough for the woman to decide to immediately raise this unpleasant question point blank, instead of spending a long time carefully collecting other evidence. A little time passed, and readers were shown how Louis scolded the venerable minister as if he were a naughty child, and the latter covered his face with his hands and desperately asked not to make such a noise. Having overcome his first attack of embarrassment, Albert simply said that he had thought everything through, so there was no point in condemning him in any case, and the girl, grabbing her hair, admitted that the old man was indeed very cunning. She felt herself to such a degree of oppression for perhaps the first time in her life. In her own eyes, the warrior had become an ignorant, stupid, useless amoeba. As for Lysander, he was more surprised that Gallardo refused to condemn him, although he, for a second, committed a real crime by going against the interests of his king. The old man quickly guessed that the vampire had simply gone to the farm and tried that divine food, but the girl indignantly replied that she had not known that she was not the first victim of Hazel's food. Taking a breath and forcing a weak smile, Louis decided to ask Albert directly if Edwina really was the malicious swindler that the court described her as. The head of the Department of Palace Affairs answered very simply, "Yes, because the brunette really doesn't care about material values. This is not a hypocritical pretense." With another weak chuckle, Gallardo admitted that she had no idea who she was dealing with at all. She had expected anything but that the protagonist would turn out to be just a fanatical collective farmer. Then the elderly aristocrat explained with a smile that the main character had ironclad rights to her patch of land, and no one could take it away without arbitrariness. The vampire, however, had no intention of arguing or snitching to Langford. In fact, she was now entirely on Hazel's side and, as a result, Albert's, and it was as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. It's very unpleasant, you see, when those around you don't believe your arguments and see you as nothing more than a sellout with an insatiable stomach. Of course, they would have to keep quiet anyway, lest the enraged king send them both flying head over heels from the balcony, but that sacrifice was easy enough to make. After this, Gallardo decided to ask Lysander another, more intimate question, but the Count interrupted her with a suggestion to go to the greenhouse. There would definitely be no strangers there, but extremely sensitive ears. The audience was not shown how the head of the department explains to the leader of the knights what happened. Instead, the author brought the conversation to an end, when Louis asked why the minister did this at all, and he admitted that it was the coffee. But Louis didn't believe it, and asked Albert to reveal his true motives. After all, no matter how much of a gourmet they both were, they would never betray Langford just because of delicious food. Lysander feigned bewilderment and asked what they were talking about, and the vampiress admitted that he was now behaving completely differently from how he did in everyday life, more like an official during another exchange of intrigues. The old man did not directly confirm that the woman had guessed something, but his entire appearance literally screamed that Gallardo had really hit the nail on the head. Before answering the question, Albert, in turn, decided to ask Louis herself why all this time she was wandering aimlessly around the palace like a ghost and did not even try to take a step beyond the threshold. Looking away, the red-haired vampire quietly admitted that she simply had no doubts about her, without specifically specifying which person she was talking about. This was not necessary, because both participants in the conversation knew how to read between the lines, and then the leader of the knights suggested imagining the following situation. Let's say the protagonist really did subjugate her mind with magical food. At first, the woman didn't notice that the tart tasted a little strange, despite its wonderfulness, but the more she got slapped by her friends, the more she thought about it. Lysander didn't even wait for Gallardo to finish his slightly confused story. He already understood what kind of cats were so desperately scratching at the soul of the red-haired warrior. Albert replied with some irony that if you look at it that way, it all fits together very conveniently, and then the audience was shown Hazel's house. This was part of the Count's narrative. He was suggesting that they were not just being treated, that there was something much more serious hidden behind it. No, Lysander wasn't going to tell them about hypnotic spells or intoxicating potions or any other nonsense. In fact, he believed that Edwina's whole secret was that she, in a way, treated them to a happy time. That's right, no sinister or supernatural secret, just the old minister and the young head of the military order experienced real happiness while visiting their new neighbor. The main character treated them to such delicious food that it was impossible to find even in the royal kitchen, regaled them with facts about agriculture and nature, and simply talked like with ordinary people, without sycophancy. The red-haired girl listened to the elderly aristocrat with all possible attention, and from the sparkle in her violet eyes, it was clear that these words found a response in Louis's soul. Lysander ended his speech by saying that all the big shots from the palace should visit Hazel, because she would be to all of them what coffee was to him, a walking anti-stress. And by everyone, the Count actually meant the king himself, although he didn't say so directly. And fortunately for him, Gallardo was more than willing to help in such a matter. After this, the red-haired vampire returned home in an incredibly elevated mood. She no longer felt like a nobody and even received a plan of action. Here she unexpectedly came across two of her subordinates. The young vampires, whispering like thieves, were arguing about how to dispose of the tickets to the opera. The woman replied in a very dry tone that they were great, and the two young ghouls in black and red cloaks almost died of horror, deciding that the mistress would now punish them. Fortunately, they were very lucky. Gallardo had managed to change quite a bit during the previous evening, so now she looked at worst with some mockery. Then another vampire knight suddenly appeared, stumbling and sweating, but he still decided to discuss with his superior the issue of disciplinary action for what happened during the day. The man assured Louis that such a thing would never happen again, and, somewhere in the distance, several of the teenagers who had attended Hazel as part of the first team looked at each other in relief. Looking at the Grand Master with utmost seriousness and some hope, the envoy asked for permission to deal with the main character in his own way. Meanwhile, the protagonist herself was lying on the bed in the position of a starfish and muttering very contentedly about how eventful the past day had been. At this point, she decided to go to bed to gain strength before the next day, when at some point her attention was drawn to something else. The girl stared at it very carefully. It was the infamous hole in the roof that had been mentioned many times by various characters, and it was so big that it could easily have been a window. And then a series of strange, loud, and abrupt sounds began, as if some madman had decided to jump on the roof of a garden house in the middle of the night. In another situation, this could still be attributed to the actions of birds, but Hazel also heard a muffled but quite human whisper, so she hurried to look out the window. Unfortunately, from this position, the main character still could not see who had decided to take charge of the top of her private property, so she hurried out into the street. And the first thing the protagonist saw when she found herself outside was a real mountain of neatly chopped firewood and a completely intact staircase, as if her house had been visited by a whole team of fairy godmothers in a good-natured mood. It looked and felt so fantastic that Edwina seriously wondered if she was still asleep, not to mention that the stairs were positioned as if they led not into nothingness, but to some place. And then something even more amazing happened. Out of nowhere, a freshly picked rose fell right into May's hands, as if left by a young aristocrat in love. The flower was, of course, a gift, but it also came with a note. Opening it, Hazel read aloud the following inscription: "The Knights of the Brotherhood will definitely treat you to something delicious." As soon as she realized what she had read, the protagonist turned very pink with pleasure. It seemed that just a little more and she would become a second sun, flooding everything around with light. After this, there was a small time skip. The author scrolled the narrative to the next morning to show how a certain man becomes incredibly angry and horrified when he sees Edwina's renovated house. It was the young king. Not long ago, Langford was assured that the problem would soon solve itself, but now, when he saw that this was not the case at all, the blonde experienced a terrible shock. The unfortunate sovereign became so ill that he could not stay on his feet. Instead, he very slowly, trying not to take his hands off the balcony, sank to the ground. The next day, the audience is shown Louis walking through the park with utmost nonchalance, twirling her finger in the air and whistling a song when someone calls out to her. It was a young sovereign. Seeing his sister in arms, he asked her to come over on some important matter, without wasting time on morning greetings and other formalities. Gallardo didn't pay attention to this, and first of all greeted the young man, and the latter, frowning angrily, replied, Yes, good morning, just come up to me already." The reason, of course, turned out to be the protagonist's house. The enraged king pointed at it with his hand and asked the vampiress whether this hut had looked like disgusting ruins just yesterday. The warrior mumbled yes and quickly looked away. She urgently needed to think of something before the completely enraged Langford sent her flying head first onto the pavement. The crowned blonde, however, was not so easy to deceive. It turned out that he remembered perfectly well the words of Cain, the beast cat, that Hazel's dwelling was on its last legs, and that there was a huge hole in its roof. The woman realized that trying to convince the sovereign now was pointless and simply dangerous, and so she urgently tried to come up with a convincing lie. But this was not so easy, because the king did not give her a break and drilled her with his intent gaze. In the end, the vampire couldn't think of anything better than to smile very falsely and carelessly declare that she didn't remember anything, and in general she had important things to do, so adieu. Langford was so taken aback by this impudence that he didn't even order Lewis to be punished, but only dropped his jaw. And then the readers are shown how May, in her stupidity, decided to take 2 full buckets of water at once, and now regretted it. Naturally, the brunette didn't even have time to finish her thoughts when help miraculously appeared. Gallardo came from around the corner, easily took 1 bucket and greeted the straw hat with a grin. Then the standard exchange of smiles and messages began. The red-haired one was going to carry the 2nd bucket, and the dark-haired one refused, instead suggesting a walk. With shining eyes, the protagonist also asked when the crowd would come to her again and try to exert psychological pressure. The straw hat is interested in this. Louis, looking at her guiltily, assured her that this would never happen again, but in her mind she whined, "Poor thing, what monstrous stress you're under all day long." Edwina was more frightened and upset by this news than pleased, and she decided that Langford was to blame. But Gallardo hastened to assure her interlocutor that no, that was not the case at all. The king, of course, did not even think of stopping the confrontation with the hated swindler, who came out of the water dry and even with a win after each incident. It was the warrior herself who ordered everyone not to touch May anymore, deciding that it would be better this way. But now she realized that she had become somewhat dependent on the Marinier farm, so of course they would never try to kick Hazel out again, no matter what the king said about it. The protagonist, of course, was glad that on the one hand she had another friend, but on the other hand, she didn't even try to hide her disappointment that no one else would come to make terrifying threats and then sit down for tea. Well, the main character was going to get even, at least in the sense that after delivering the buckets, she would fill Louis with a huge number of pies and would not accept any objections. Then began the standard tea party with cakes, cheerful laughter, exchanging jokes, and other carefree routine, as if these 2 girls had met yesterday or even many years ago. After this, the action moved straight to late evening, when the sky had turned black and most people were already asleep, and the audience was shown a colossal mansion, more like a palace. An old man dressed as a servant walked slowly along the corridors, holding a small tray with a lit candle in front of him, and his eyes were fixed on the sides. As it turned out, he was Luis's subordinate, because Gallardo herself, no longer in her usual black uniform but in a simple sleep dress, was sitting thoughtfully at the table and writing something until the old man respectfully called out to her. The vampiress was so taken aback that she spilled some ink on the text she had been creating with such care, and the servant realized that it would be safest to leave immediately to check on his mistress later. The next day, now relatively calm, although still feeling terribly awkward, the woman suggested to her interlocutor that they go for a walk to a cafe on Sunday. She naturally addressed Hazel, and the latter listened with wide eyes of surprise to the proposal to arrange a day full of pleasure and delicious food. Interestingly, all this time Gallardo was actually talking to the hat, continuing to pretend to comply with the royal decree. However, the protagonist was not interested in her proposal in any case. Poor Louise was struck by lightning. She had spent the whole night painstakingly thinking up, writing down, and rehearsing this speech, only to be turned down like that. Trying to figure out what was wrong, the warrior awkwardly asked if Edwina really didn't like the same bright hair ribbons, but the brunette quickly replied that she did. The same thing happened with questions about the cafe, various snacks, desserts, and entertainment, and by the end the unfortunate vampire was ready to openly cry. The reason, as expected, turned out to be simply damn farming. Until Hazel does everything she has planned, she absolutely does not care about the world around her and what it has to offer. Another person might have been furious and made a real scandal, or at least would have been immensely surprised by such a reason. But Gallardo only cried humiliatingly, admitting defeat, and asked if she could at least help then. The young farmer happily responded to this proposal with her consent, and Louis, who a second ago resembled a whining wreck, instantly perked up. It didn't matter to her at all what she did or when. If the offer came from Edwina, this woman would even go and haul manure with a beaming smile. When the brunette was left alone, she made a special note in the calendar so as not to forgive the treasured Sunday, and then began to think, what special thing to cook for the vampire, technically the first worker of the farm. After a few minutes of thought, the main character came to the conclusion that the most ideal solution in this case is beef cooked in a pot over a high flame. And everything would be fine, but Hazel quickly discovered one small problem. She didn't have any ingredients for this dish right now, not even the most stale lettuce leaves. At that moment, May had to bitterly admit that real life is not a game at all, where you can get what you want with a click, and if you want to eat normally, you have to go to the cities for food. On the other hand, it made the girl think for the first time about one important point. Did anyone out there in the outside world know that Langford had issued a special decree for everyone to ignore one specific person? In a completely different place, meanwhile, a very loud and angry cry of "Lewis" was heard, and the owner of this name looked ahead as if she had already resigned herself to the coming scolding. Naturally, it turned out to be the king. He finally found out that one of his close associates was actually supporting the evil swindler and was now throwing thunder and lightning because of it. The warrior listened to these cries with an absolutely calm face and then laconically asked, "What kind of girl?" which made Langford almost choke on air. Demonstrating absolute indifference to the young ruler with her whole appearance, Gallardo said that she had not communicated with any women in the last few days, and if the blonde saw otherwise, then he should get checked by a doctor. After that, she simply turned around and left, as if she was talking not to a powerful king who could cut off her head, but to some stranger, and the young man looked after the vampire for a long time with resentment and anger, trying to understand how she had the audacity to use the laws against him. When the woman had completely disappeared from sight, the young monarch thought with a dejected look about why these misfortunes were happening to him at all. After all, he had honestly tried to buy the land for a decent sum in gold, not to mention that his predecessor would not have even gone for such a thing. The old king would have simply destroyed the house. If this man were still in power, Hazel's fate would have been much more tragic. She would have been thrown out into the street, like a dog that had become hateful to its owner, and even the symbolic compensation for the damage to the destroyed property would have ended up entirely in the pockets of officials. Yes, the Brotherhood still remembered very well how cruel and merciless their previous ruler had been, and that was precisely why Langford had vowed to be as humane and fair as possible to all his subjects, no matter how much they personally irritated him. On the other hand, he would not allow anyone to use tolerance to mock others and profit at their expense, and now he remembered that Edwina was the granddaughter of Baron Mailfield. A little later, and in a completely different place, a woman of high birth saw something amazing and hastened to draw the attention of her teenage daughter to it. As it turned out, they saw Gallardo, who, as agreed with May, was working in the garden, and even with such an air as if she had actually come to relax on a beautiful beach. And she, frankly speaking, was not alone in such eccentricity. Soon she was joined by two more knights now wearing ordinary checkered shirts that they did not mind getting dirty in the ground, and they had hoes in their hands. One of them, who looked younger, pressed his fist to his chest and shouted that he couldn't do it. Where had you ever seen a sane person talking to his hat like a complete idiot? However, the hat can actually talk, and now it even has a painted face. The warrior himself drew it on an old wide-brimmed hat and proudly showed it to the leader. From the outside, their group looked so brutal that it was bordering on the absurd. Relaxed Louis in modern sunglasses, a strong and sullen man in a cowboy hat with a displeased face, and another man with a blissful smile and closed eyes. This scene was observed by two more of Langford's closest assistants, the still nameless brown-haired man in black and the catman Caen, and both were experiencing severe shock. Gallardo and her subordinates had already worked hard in the garden, which was unusual, so the vampire encouraged the men, saying that everything was fine, to which the beast-man screamed, "What's good about this?" He called the vampire for a private conversation and again began to yell at her, asking what she was wearing, but the woman, still relaxed, only asked what was wrong. She looked so cool. The brunette, trying to keep his emotions under control, noted, "What a blessing that Laurendelle doesn't see this." And Caen hastened to agree, because if someone else noticed Louis in such a state, she would be disgraced for life. Of course, because of that same Laurendelle, Langford's elven advisor, that pointy-eared one, even after many centuries, would tell everyone how stupid one of his colleagues looked. He would have continued to rain thunder and lightning down on Gallardo for a long time, but then something fell on him, a large branch from General Aram's tree, which was considered one of the national treasures. Both Louis and the brown-haired man looked at this with their mouths open, a little dead inside from horror. This is roughly how Christians might react to someone being hit by a crossbar. Cain was no less frightened. As soon as he regained consciousness, he realized with horror that he would now be the first suspect in the accusation of vandalism of epic proportions. When the beastman also realized that the accusers would have cast-iron evidence, he grinned, but it was not a cheerful grin, but a grimace of impending hysteria. The Catman desperately tried to fix something, grabbing the damned branch with his long, flexible tail to hide it under his tail, but the brown-haired man mercilessly noted that it was completely useless. The ensuing scene was equal parts tragic and comical. Cain quietly sobbed, imagining his journey to the executioner's dungeons, while his colleagues anxiously examined the branch as if it were a sick baby. After completing her inspection, Louis gave out catastrophically bad news. The general tree, the sacred, most precious tree within their kingdom, had simply begun to rot. Everyone present was incredibly shocked, and Gallardo even started scolding the guy with cat ears, like, "Look what your actions led to in the end. Do you understand what a scandal there will be if they find out about this?" But she might not have added the last part, because the beastman understood the consequences perfectly well. He himself had recently given a lecture at a scientific conference about how in the Brotherhood the highest ranks receive the most lashes. And since Cain is one of the leaders of the Sacred Knights, a close advisor to the king, then for this he will be completely deprived of his privileges and position. But Louis and the brown-haired man, of course, did not want this to happen to their friend. It would seem that the situation was completely hopeless, but suddenly the man in black had an idea. Troubles could be avoided if they simply healed the sacred tree. While he and Gallardo were pondering how this could be done, the Catman jumped around them in panic and argued that this was complete nonsense. How could you even cure a plant? Did they understand anything about this? The dark-haired guy said that the same Laurendelle had most likely already tried to do something like this in secret from everyone, and for some reason this angered and scared the vampire, so much so that she took off her glasses and asked if the interlocutor had gone crazy. Looking very closely at the brown-haired man, the woman forbade addressing the pointy-eared man on this issue, because he was one of those people who would rather die than say even a word of untruth. The men had no words to argue against this. In fact, they might as well try to prove that water is not really wet and that fire just seems hot. Luckily for them, Gallardo had the right person at his disposal, and it doesn't take even a rudimentary intellect to figure out that he's talking about the main character. So far, the woman had not said who exactly she was talking about, so the guys did not suspect a trick. The man and the beastman looked at their friend with such hope, as if she could save their lives. A quick cut to them both standing in front of Hazel, looking like they were being forced to do some incredibly disgusting, but unfortunately necessary job. Louis, meanwhile, began to explain that two other great knights urgently needed help, so she led them along a secret path, all the while acting like she was in an action movie about cool spies. In fact, she simply led her comrades through the back door, and then, without pretense, began to explain in a not entirely clear way the problem with Leonard Maximus Reutenberg. That's what they called the tree. Of course, it was not a sentient being like an ent, but simply a symbol of the king's influence and power. But that was precisely why the news of its illness could cause so many problems, for it was the same as saying, "The king is losing his grip." As for Khan, he still saw himself as the root cause of the problem. After all, he was the one who was constantly cutting the tree's branches and occasionally scratching or peeling it, but he didn't do it with malicious intent. Now the Catman was tearing his hair out, sobbing and swearing that he didn't deserve this, but he was trying to carefully look after the precious plant, and the other knights quietly chimed in that they were also protecting the general. In any case, this is a very serious incident, the truth about which must not leak out under any circumstances, otherwise the Beastman will completely lose his position at court. And they, being friends, could never allow this to happen, not to mention that it would be simply unfair, because Khan really wasn't trying to deliberately harm the national treasure. The knights didn't know how to fix the situation on their own, and that's why Louis led them to one straw hat. In addition, she finally named the brown-haired man in dark clothes Zigbalt. The argument the vampire used was very simple and logical. A person wearing such a hat clearly has deep knowledge of plants. And, as a result, she was confident that such a person had sufficient knowledge and skills to save the dying tree, and with every word she said, Hazel seemed to blossom. The protagonist readily confirmed that yes, she had already treated Flora representatives once, and Gallardo, with shining eyes, added that it would be very sweet of May to save the vampire, the cat, and the bear. But unfortunately, that was where the good news ended for them. After a quick inspection of the sacred tree, Edwina immediately realized that the situation was very bad. Many of the leaves had turned yellow, and in many places the bark had turned black. In general, if it is so important to them that the general remains alive and well, then treatment must be started right now, without wasting a minute. But unfortunately, the main character does not have anything suitable on hand. Fortunately, it wasn't poor farmers who turned to her for help, but the most powerful people in the Brotherhood after the king himself, so within 10 minutes, all the necessary ingredients were available. Now, with a knife to cut off the affected areas, wine and alcohol for disinfection, and a clean cloth, Hazel was ready to begin her direct duty as the chosen one of the god of the sun and fertility. The work eventually continued until the evening. The sky had already changed from a bright white-blue hue to orange when the girl finally decided that this time it was enough. As for the knights, all this time they were watching the protagonist work with rapt attention, with a quiet and desperate plea that the general would finally get better. At that moment, Hazel put down the knife, picked up the bottle of wine and began to drink straight from the bottle, to the shock of Caen, who realized that he and his colleagues had been used as trivial delivery men under a plausible pretext. Then she turned away and began to do something with her hands, which the beastman stared at with an empty face. What was happening was increasingly reminiscent of some kind of shamanism for him. In reality, Edwina used alcohol, among other things, to thoroughly wet the earth, resulting in a clay-like consistency, and to use it to seal the cuts on the tree trunk. As she later explained, the makeshift stopper also included a wine cork made from oak, a material known for its natural disinfectant properties. Of course, over time, the venerable general will grow bark, becoming strong and healthy again, but until that moment, such a patch will protect him from any microbes. As for why the brunette used bottle caps, the explanation was simple. She had long ago learned what material they were made of, especially since they were a product for the nobility. A little more time passed, and voila, now the brave tree general, the pride and talisman of the entire brotherhood, looked wonderful, as if no rot had struck him. The knights felt incredible relief, especially Cain, who felt like a noose had been removed from his neck, and the protagonist, meanwhile, ordered them to come tomorrow and check on the patient's condition. Hazel was sure that by dawn the plant would be completely healthy, but no. A whole day passed, but the general continued to quietly rot, to Edwina's horror and sadness. She, Louise, and Caen decided to secretly visit the tree at night, and realizing that the problem was still not solved, Gallardo sadly suggested that their pet was simply quietly dying of old age. Hearing this, the Catman lost heart again, and it was difficult to say what frightened him more, the loss of all regalia or the tragic disappearance of a familiar detail of the world order. Trying not to cause panic and not let it overwhelm her own mind, Hazel wisely suggested that they just wait another day. Perhaps a little later, the general would still start to recover. Unfortunately, a day later, the situation had not changed either. New spots of rot appeared on the bark, and noticing them, May only sank to the ground, trying to figure out how to proceed. Standing nearby, Kane quietly replied that Edwina had done all she could, so she shouldn't blame herself, and as for him, the beast man admitted with a sad smile that he was ready to accept punishment for his oversight. The protagonist said nothing. She simply looked at the young aristocrat with genuine sadness and sympathy, demonstrating that she would very much like to save him. As Hazel walked home along the lantern-lit path, she couldn't stop thinking about new ways to restore the sacred plant's vitality. The girl had long been tormented by the feeling that she had missed something, some small but important detail. And now, replaying the knight's words in her head, she realized that she had been acting incorrectly all this time. At first, the brunette decided that the unfortunate general was attacked by insects, and this was an easy conclusion. In the end, the plant began to rot, and under its bark, whole hordes of many-legged little monsters were discovered. But then, readers are shown ancient memories of the protagonist when she was an 8-year-old girl. Then she saw how some man was caring for an unhealthy-looking tree and demanded to know what happened. Slightly taken aback by such pressure, the bearded man replied that the plant was fine, but Hazel, not even thinking of leaving behind, again asked for details. The answer turned out to be very trivial and very familiar to anyone who has ever had to work with flora. The tree began to rot due to an excessive amount of water. The main character realized that the same thing was happening to the venerable general, and she rushed back to him as fast as she could, so that even the knights grieving in the park were taken aback. No, the protagonist did not reprimand them for their clumsy exit. She did not say anything and did not even turn around. The brunette continued to run, wanting to check her guess as soon as possible. However, Louis, Zigbalt, and Kane immediately realized that something strange had happened and followed Hazel, so that they saw the farmer, with the air of a scientist who had made a discovery, scoop up some soil in her hands. Finally, turning to the aristocrats, she assured them that she now understood everything, but the details would come later because now was the time for action, not talk. As before, Edwina demanded that her customers give her special ingredients. This time they turned out to be lime powder and, oddly enough, dwarf flower pots. Naturally, she needed not just one head of cabbage, but a whole bed, at least 3 or 4 dozen, so May sent the all-powerful nobles to look for wholesalers in the middle of the night, but the knights were not against it, as long as it helped. Having carefully examined the general's roots, Hazel concluded that they were seriously damaged by rot, but some of them managed to retain enough strength, which meant that there was still hope. Time passed. The brunette, having finally received what she wanted, scattered powder around the general, planted cabbage, and, under the puzzled looks of the aristocrats, declared the work complete. Now that the most important thing was done, the protagonist could explain to Louis, Zigbalt, and Kane that the limestone and vegetables were needed to repair the damage from the intoxication, and the vampiress and the beastmen almost lost their power of speech, deciding that someone wanted to poison the tree. It might sound crazy, considering that it was a plant, albeit an important one, but Edwina confirmed that it was true. The tree commander almost died from poisoning, just like a human. However, this was not said in a solemn, serious, or frightening tone, as one might think. On the contrary, the farmer's wife could not hold back a smile, and stars and imps danced in her eyes. If we move directly to the explanation, then the logic was as follows. Despite its old age, the sacred tree was very strong and healthy, which means that the disease could not come suddenly without a good reason. For example, a change in the surrounding environment. There had to be a root cause for this factor. Something had to happen at the time when Louis, Kane, Zigbalt, and the elven advisor were courting the general. The brown-haired man opened his eyes and mouth in shock because he immediately remembered what happened that day, and the beast cat smiled very tensely and looked away, understanding what would happen next. Then the young man sharpened his long, claw-like nails on the tree bark like an ordinary animal, and his comrades even had to forcefully tear him away from the venerable plant that time. Then everyone scolded the honorable official and commander as if he were a small child, trying to prove to him that if his cat instincts continued to take over, the poor tree would eventually get sick. Hazel turned away without much sympathy and said that she thought so. Kane, having received a full bucket of moralizing and abuse, got nervous, and then did something similar to the usual ripping off. But it would be an unfair mistake to blame only the Beast Man for all the troubles. Turning to Louis and Zagbalt, the protagonist added that they were also to blame for what happened. Each of them, except for the elf, was afraid that the Britannia's plant treasure would spoil, and then the epaulets would fly off their shoulders, so they secretly came and fed their favorite with fertilizers. It was done with good intentions, but as a farmer, the main character understood perfectly well that these actions only brought harm, and now she was going to explain this to others. The knights were embarrassed, scared, and began to sort things out. But Hazel did not let the scandal get into full swing. She demanded to immediately tell who used what kind of fertilizer. True, the vampire, the beastman, and the man turned out to be complete laymen in the field of gardening, so they didn't give any useful answers. They took the most expensive ones from the biggest store. However, this was enough for Edwina, and she pointed an accusing finger at her interlocutors, adding that one of them had brought boron fertilizer, and the excessive amount had led to poisoning. This was a particularly unpleasant scenario, since such intoxication can very easily be confused with an attack by dangerous insects, which is what happened to the protagonist. But, to be fair, even people who have been working with flora all their lives periodically make a similar mistake, which only leads to a waste of effort, time, money, and the death of trees. Shaking her head sadly, Hazel whispered, "How much fertilizer did you use anyway?" And everyone present immediately felt incredibly ashamed, like children caught misbehaving. May, however, was not about to rain down thunder and lightning on them. Instead, she continued to explain that in order to save the general, limestone was needed first of all. It would cover the roots from the forest, like a shield. Cabbage, in turn, will take direct damage. This plant absorbs liquids very well, so the sacred tree will no longer receive a dose of poison. In any case, the worst is already behind them. Now they know exactly what happened to the honorable commander. They have taken the necessary measures, and now they just need to wait a little. None of the noble knights had any arguments to dispute Edwina's words. In terms of agriculture, they trusted her, just as the soldiers, in turn, trusted them, and as the future showed, it paid off. 4 days passed, and everyone who knew about the tragedy that happened to the sacred plant now looked with relief and delight at how it was blooming again, delighting the eye with its thick green crown. It was like a picture from a fairy tale where good wizards and fairies solved the problems of noble heroes with a wave of a magic wand. But Cain still had certain doubts. All these days he had thought carefully about what had happened, about Hazel's words, and now he had come up with a deep thought. Although friendship in general is a wonderful phenomenon, sometimes best friends can poison each other's hearts. After biting his lips for a few more seconds and turning over some new statement in his head, the beastman turned to the protagonist, but by that moment the brunette had already disappeared without a trace. The men's mouths dropped open, unable to believe that the main character would just leave after everything that had happened, as if it was some kind of trifle. But the vampire added with a grin that her adopted sister was always like that. And with an even wider grin, Gallardo announced that now that everything was settled, she would be able to happily return to work on her beloved farm. Zigbalt and Cain were left watching the women leave in quiet shock. They didn't even have time to simply thank Hazel for saving their skins from shame. On the other hand, they received visual proof that May was not at all the greedy, cunning pig that the courtiers had initially painted her as, and here the narrative returned to the protagonist. Instantly forgetting about the rest of the world, the brunette cooed at her own garden beds, praising them for growing so well and not spoiling at all. And then the girl completely switched onto the mode of a fanatical fan of agriculture. As her fans knew her before, she completely forgot about this story with saving the state treasure, and now she was thinking about how best to saturate her vegetables. And then Hazel felt a very gentle, almost weightless touch. Turning around, she did not see a person, only a small green leaf, which was now dancing in the wind. The young farmer looked at this tiny sign for a long time. It enchanted her so much that now for a moment she forgot about her usual work. It also made her remember that there were 4 great knights, and that some of the general's roots were kept healthy by being coated in oil, something that only Lorendel Blame, the elven general who was the only one who knew how to handle plants, could do. Right now, he was standing in the clearing where the wooden general grew, looking in bewilderment at the numerous heads of cabbage, wondering what had happened here. His Majesty Langford was also present, and fortunately they both had no idea that one of the royal treasures had been poisoned and had to be rescued urgently. The king, however, added that the servants told him how they had seen Zigbalt, Caen, and Louis in each other's company, and this gave the pointy-eared minister certain thoughts. It turned out that he knew that just recently the brown-haired man and the cat man had scolded the vampire, so such a quick reconciliation looked strange, and the young sovereign, realizing where blame was heading, felt a cold sweat running down his back. However, he quickly had no time for this. Terrible fires were raging in the surrounding forests, so the monarch needed Zigbalt to deal with them. And somewhere in a completely different place, one man admitted that, "Then I wanted to dig a hole and hide in it." Naturally, it was the 3 remaining knights. Now that the threat had finally passed, they could afford to release their stress by laughing heartily at each other's mistakes. As usual, Gallardo was the one having the most fun. She found it incredibly funny that their asses had been saved from the court by none other than a small, modest fan of agriculture. Well, now that they'd learned their lesson about not judging a book by its cover, they had to figure out how to best explain the presence of the garden bed in the park. And just then, Cain noticed 2 shadows looming over them. Naturally, it was Laurendale and Langford. They heard the whole conversation, and their faces were so dark and stern that even Louis began to sweat and almost physically felt like an aspen stake was piercing her chest. Some time passed. The king was now in his office, wearily propping his head up with his palm, and then asked a servant to call a certain sage Rastavan. Then, in the park, a real dispute broke out between him and his closest comrades. The blonde accused them of betrayal, while the knights tried to prove that Hazel was not some kind of evil witch. At one point, Langford became so angry that he shouted, "Are you really my best friends?" And Cain and Gallardo could only respond with sorrowful looks. In the end, they only answered that their sovereign was now too agitated. The blonde's face was flushed, and his eyes were wet with tears of anger and pain, and therefore he would not listen to anything. Now, alone, the young king tried to understand what had gone wrong. At what point had this damned Malefield confused the heads of his closest associates and servants? At this point, the previously mentioned Rastavan arrived, looking like a stereotypical old wizard in a hooded robe, except for the flirty pink bow that adorned his beard, and was delighted, thinking that Langford had called him in for the experiment. The blonde replied briefly that he approved of its implementation and wished for it to happen over the garden next to the palace, and the old man was even taken aback before flatteringly remarking how clever it was. Deep down, the king was incredibly angry at the main character. He felt that she had stolen his dearest and closest people and non-humans, but this would never happen again. The mysterious experiment had to do with artificial precipitation technologies, and upon hearing that they worked perfectly, Langford, with a feverish gleam in his eyes, ordered that they begin immediately. Meanwhile, in a completely different place, Zigbalt was kneeling in front of 2 very similar girls, and justifying himself that he was forced to leave to stop the raging fire in the forests. One of them was quietly crying and looking at her feet. The other was looking straight at the man in front of her with a detached look, and from their thoughts it became known that the twins were so often ill that they could only afford a picnic once a year. This was the curse of the Saxony Spiegel family. Its head and patriarch killed nightmarish monsters, and the aunts became famous as combat riders and field commanders. But even they were incredibly frail and weak until they were 10 years old. If some killer had entered the clan's abode to destroy its future generation, the assassin would have only had to press a little on the children's necks to squeeze the life out of them. And these 2 girls were also the fruits of a marriage between 2 already quite old people, so it was especially hard for them, and of course they really hoped to get some relief at least at a picnic. Then someone else approached them. Addressing this person, Zigbalt asked for forgiveness for having to take a vacation again, but the stranger reacted to this calmly. It was blame, but he no longer looked like the usual Snow King around him. The elf was wearing a slightly more informal outfit, and he smiled kindly at the 2 delighted girls. Shayton extended his hand to greet his friend, but Laurendale only turned away, demonstrating with his whole appearance that he did not wish to converse longer than necessary. This was the aftermath of the memorable quarrel over Hazel. Not only the king, but also the elf now felt betrayed, but Zigbalt was still glad of his presence because the twins liked the pointy-eared uncle. Smiling at the children one last time and assuring them that he would soon return home, the dark-haired knight, looking brave, jumped on his horse and rode away. When he was completely out of sight, Blame led the twins to frolic in the meadow. While they ran after each other with cheerful laughter, Lorendelle watched this with a smile from a little distance. Few would have believed that this cold-blooded, buttoned-up old man, feared even by other great knights, was capable of such gentleness. But it was so. Then they laid the tablecloth and took out some simple snacks. From the outside, it seemed like a real idyll, a kind of pastoral paradise for just a few people. Then one of the little girls drew a picture with a felt-tip pen, and with her eyes shining with delight, showed it to a pointy-eared man with long blonde hair. However, the man did not react. While his charges continued to entertain themselves, Blame took advantage of this, sat down under a tree, and blissfully dozed off. Other children would have started to act up and wake up their guardian, demanding attention, but the twins, characteristically, showed understanding. It must be really very difficult to work as a grandmaster. And then they simultaneously grinned at each other very widely and even predatorily. While the adult is not looking, you can have fun the way you really want. Luckily, they weren't planning on beating each other with sticks and knives, setting fire to the grass and houses or anything like that. Instead, they decided to braid Lorendelle's hair. And then something even more amazing was revealed to the readers. Blame was perfectly aware of everything, but he was deliberately pretending to be deeply asleep in order to save face and please the kids at the same time. Unfortunately, even iron discipline sometimes gave way, and after a few minutes the pointy-eared knight fell asleep completely sincerely, blissfully blowing bubbles from his graceful nose. The two little Saxony Spiegels argued quietly for a while about not being able to braid their hair the way they had planned, but then decided to just do something else. Leaving Lorendelle to continue sleeping under the tree, they went into the nearest forest, where with cheerful whooping and squealing they began to weave wreaths of flowers and place them on each other's heads. And then it started raining, hard, cold, and sudden. Even for an adult and healthy person it would have been uncomfortable, not to mention two small children with extremely poor health. Naturally, they were both terribly frightened, but while one was simply horrified, unable to understand what to do, the other was trying to find a way out for herself and her sister. The two little girls, holding hands, dropped all their toys and ran along the path, and it was hard to tell whether they wanted to find Blame or any more or less suitable shelter. Due to their young age and poor form, the girls could not run fast or for long, and in their pranks they went too far into the forest, so the leading aristocrat quickly realized that they had to find shelter somewhere at any cost. They continued running for some time until they finally stopped, out of fear and despair, because the forest did not stop, as if they had ended up in some kind of scary fairy tale. And that wasn't the worst news. The girl that her sister was leading began to weaken. It was already difficult for her to stand on her own, and even whispering, "Unni, I'm cold," took a lot of strength. A few seconds later, she lost consciousness and collapsed into the arms of her twin, who was still trying to find a way out of trouble, despite the fact that her heart was constricted with panic. A few more moments and the little aristocrat, wisely forgetting about any rules and pride, screamed loudly, calling for someone to come and save them. And to their great happiness, there were indeed ears that caught the call for help. Hazel turned her head warily when this cry reached her. Despite the bad weather, Edwina continued to work outside, trying to drive piles into the ground to make her property more resilient to such monsoons. And then Lorendelle opened his eyes. All this time he continued to doze, not really feeling the effects of the cold rainwater, but the absence of Isabella and Anna Sophia finally brought the elf out of the world of dreams. Blame called the girls by name and looked around, but the only answer he got was the sound of a billion drops hitting the ground, as if nature itself was laughing at the careless guard. And then he became afraid. No, he was overcome with real, blood-freezing horror, so powerful that the man had to cover his mouth with his hand so as not to scream into the skies darkened by the bad weather. Having barely managed to overcome his panic, the pointy-eared Grandmaster rushed to search for the twins, who by that time were already lying on the ground, completely weakened and unable to even scream. Perhaps in a different situation, their life's journey would have ended there, but to the girls' great luck, they were found, and the protagonist was the first to do so. The little girls barely realized what was happening around them. They realized that some person had found them, but they could not see Edwina's face, and the young aristocrats also did not realize how they were wrapped in a cloak and taken on their backs. In an instant, both Saxons lost consciousness, unable to resist this deadening cold, while the main character, by no means a strong woman, ran with them both to the house. You didn't have to be a doctor to understand how badly the young noblewomen were doing. As soon as May got home and laid them on the bed, she gasped in horror at the realization that the twins had one foot in the grave. It was now that the innate gift from the solar deity came in handy. Not long ago, the protagonist had planted mint, and fortunately it was already fully ripe and could be used. The brunette wasn't a healer, but she understood plants better than most people and non-humans, and thanks to this, she could make a medicine that would at least restore part of Isabella and Anna. It was an unknown amount of time before the high-born little girls finally woke up. They were awakened by the smell of honey and a strange menthol taste in their mouths, and, opening their eyes, the girls saw May, carefully sitting next to their beds with a large cup. However, before the children could get a word in edgewise, Edwina put her finger to her lips and said that no one could talk to her. Even in such a situation, she tried to maintain the appearance of loyalty to the royal decrees. The twins only blinked their large gray eyes in response. They were not permanent residents of the palace and had no idea about Hazel's one-sided feud with Langford, not to mention that people's heads often didn't work well after illness. Then Anna and Isabella looked at each other. Without even opening their mouths, they conveyed to each other the thoughts of, how could you ignore the one who had just saved your lives? However, as we know, a child's mind works according to completely different rules than an adult's, and after just a couple of seconds, some thought came into the girls' bright heads that made them smile with delight. As it turned out, the Saxon twins mistook the protagonist for a real fairy tale fairy, one of those who save unfortunate people with a wave of a magic wand, give kind princesses various treasures, and turn pumpkins into carriages. And the rain, despite the fact that many hours had already passed, did not even think of stopping. The sky was still covered with huge dark gray clouds, and Lorendel was trying to find his charges. If someone had seen the usually proud and majestic elf from the side, they would never have believed that this was the same Grandmaster Blame, because now the pointy-eared knight looked more like a beaten and lonely stray dog. And he was in an incredible, huge, and cold as an iceberg rage, and at himself because he admitted that the disappearance of 2 innocent children was entirely on his conscience. And Lorendela couldn't get rid of the thought of Zygbalt's Saxony. Perhaps they had quarreled not so long ago because of the swindler, but deep down the elf continued to consider this man his best friend, and would not forgive himself if the brown-haired man's young relatives got into trouble. Here the aristocrat's gaze caught on something unusual, standing out sharply against the background of dark earth and damp grass. It was a pink bow, an accessory from the little girl's clothes, and a sure sign that the pointy-eared one had finally caught their trail. He looked around the area very carefully, looking for any other possible signpost, and the man quickly found a beautiful wooden house, from the chimney of which gray smoke was escaping. Blame quickly realized that his feet had led him into the domain of a malicious swindler, with whose arrival the usual life in the palace went to hell, and in the house itself, meanwhile, a loud cry of, "No!" was heard. Fortunately, these were not cries of pain or despair. One of the twins was simply arguing that she would not eat much, otherwise they would remain prisoners in the land of fairies forever, which is a well-known fairy tale motif. Her sister, with tears in her eyes, asked what she should do in such a case, because the dish that Hazel offered to the unexpected guests tasted simply divine. As for the main character herself, she was actually incredibly happy that such beautiful and cheerful girls appeared in her house. Looking at how she dried their hair, it was hard to believe that the characters met only recently, and not years ago. Then a cautious but loud and persistent knock came from behind the door. The The protagonist immediately became wary, wondering who could have appeared in such terrible weather, and the children, on the contrary, were delighted. It turned out to be, of course, Lorendel, who finally forced himself to appear before the swindler, but the sight that opened before the elf was so shocking that the man literally collapsed to the floor. Anna and Isabella, however, did not pay any attention to this. They only smiled broadly, seeing their usual guardian, and asked if he, too, had been carried away to the magical land of fairies. At the same time, the brunette continued to look at her guest with great surprise. It would never have occurred to her that the most alienated and cold of the king's confidants could be connected with two lost children. However, the facts were there. Blame looked at the twins with great regret and anxiety, while they, in turn, smiled affectionately and greeted the pointy-eared knight. The protagonist finally decided to explain herself, to tell how she heard the cries of the children and saved them. But she didn't have time. One of the little aristocrats was the first to tell how the fairy sister found them and nursed them back to health. They were more than happy to tell Lorendel that Edwina had not only saved them from dying in the cold rain, but had also dried them off and fed them the most delicious, creamy soup in the world. In the end, the only thing Blame could answer was a quiet, short, "I see," since the poor guy still hadn't fully recovered from the shock of losing the Saxon twins. He hadn't tried to talk to May yet, and she herself felt clearly awkward in the presence of this silent and aloof elf, who had no idea what was going on in his mind. Eventually, Lorendel himself began to feel embarrassed and tried to speak to Edwina, but she immediately interrupted him, not letting him finish even the first sentence, and pointed her hand to the side. Yes, it was the protagonist who once again showed the visitor from the palace a straw hat. She would have taken it in her hands, as before, but alas, this time her limbs were busy with more important matters. For some reason, the girl had been trying to pretend to the last that she was following Langford's boycott law, so she wanted Blame to pretend to talk to the hat. The usually imperturbable, pointy-eared Grandmaster blushed and clenched his fists. Only now did he fully realize that if it weren't for the presence of the main character, a monstrous tragedy would have occurred. Lorendel was now in an unpayable debt to the protagonist, and one would have to be incredibly selfish to deny such an obvious factor. It's hard to say what he would have said next because unexpected guests burst through the door again, namely, a frightened Luis Gallardo and a sleepy Caen. They expected to see only Hazel, so their eyes widened and their jaws dropped to the floor when they saw two noble girls and a wet, slightly agitated Blame in the hut. Having recovered a little from the initial shock, the two grandmasters pounced on the twins with questions about where they came from, but still enjoying the warmth and comfort of Saxony, they only said hello. Quickly putting two and two together in her head, the vampire realized that today was Anna Sophia and Isabella's picnic day, and Caen, in turn, guessed that their presence here did not mean anything good. The cat beast looked closely at Lorendel, who continued to kneel, staring at the girls and the protagonist, his face still gloomy. The red-haired girl and the tailed boy exchanged glances, and fear and shock were easily read on their faces, as if they had reviewed the memories of the participants in the tragedy that had unfolded in a matter of seconds. Luckily, the twins themselves did not allow this unpleasant and downright dangerous topic to develop. Instead, one of the girls approached Cain and demanded, to his surprise, to say hello to the fairy of this forest. Edwina, who was usually not embarrassed by other people's words and nicknames, looked away with a very awkward smile, and the young aristocrat immediately guessed who had been awarded such a respectful title. Kneeling down to look the young noblewoman straight in the eye, the beastman explained that it was best to end this conversation here, because by law no one had the right to speak to the mistress of the house or even pay attention to her. The little girl asked in bewilderment why anyone should do such a thing, and Cain answered succinctly that it was an order from His Royal Majesty, Langford. But if children of any class, age, and gender agree on one thing, it is the ability to ask one question after another, which, of course, happened in this case. The young man hesitated and then evasively reported that the young monarch had taken Edwina for a treacherous villain trying to destroy the country, and the twins immediately began to consult with each other about whether this characterization suited May. Closing her eyes, Gallardo admitted that she also did not agree with the royal opinion, and her whole appearance screamed how tired she was of pretense and this stupid decree. And she added that little children could understand what mature and wise men still stubbornly ignored, and Laurendale immediately realized that this was a painful jab at him and Langford. Blame tried to dispute this statement, but again he didn't have time. His interlocutor reminded him that paying attention to the protagonist was a violation of the law, so all words should be addressed to the straw hat. Then, perhaps for the first time in history, the elf exploded with indignation, declaring that this was too much and no human deserved to be treated like that, to which Louis, with no less expression, exclaimed, "Did you finally get it? Choked?" But then the vampire's face became very sad and even sympathetic, and she quietly warned her comrade that this was far from the first unpleasant revelation that he would have to listen to. The focus then shifted to Langford, the young lord of the Britannia, standing and looking out the window at the rain, his handsome face showing no emotion. While he continued to stand, another person was talking to someone. He was asking the third person to take control of a specially trained wyvern, as well as to use special chemical reagents. There was a noise that accompanied the opening of the great palace doors, and the crowned blonde and the court sage turned sharply. They immediately recognized Laurendale. The pointy-eared man respectfully dropped to one knee before his ruler, and then politely but firmly read out a speech in which Blame, among other things, mentioned all his titles and powers as the sovereign's confidant and one of the most important people in the kingdom. The speech boiled down to the fact that the elf considered the infamous edict to boycott Hazel Edwina May, Baron Malefield's granddaughter, a real disgrace to the royal court, and he begged Langford to repeal it. And then the elf, without any hint of respect, angrily shouted that the blonde, by calling this damn endless rain, almost killed the little sisters of his best friend. But the king refused to admit it and take responsibility. In response, Laurendale gave him a very indignant and contemptuous look, and one did not need to have magical abilities to understand that until this moment, the Grand Master had never looked at his own master like that. Then he repeated that Anna Sophia and Isabella, the younger relatives of Siegbalt of Saxony-Spiegel, had been caught in the rain and were soaking wet, and now the crowned youth was finally overcome with realization. The shock of the young monarch was so strong that for the first few seconds Langford didn't even say anything. He just stood there like a stone statue with his eyes and mouth wide open, and even after he was released, the guy could only say a quiet, "What?" Another person would probably have already thrown a tantrum, but one had to give the Lord of the Britannia his due. He only allowed himself to clench his fist hard, and then, in a businesslike tone, asked the advisor where the young twins were now. As the witches' monsoon outside continued to assault the earth and batter the plants, Laurendale explained that the worst had passed. Sophia and Isabella had been quickly found by a kind person and were now completely safe. Langford, unable to stop thinking about how he had nearly caused the deaths of two innocent little girls, had to force himself to speak again, or rather to ask which hero had accomplished this feat. It was the duty of any decent person, and even non-humans, to properly thank the savior, and the elf, losing patience, shouted that this was precisely why he had come to the young monarch's office. He, the one who had initially let the children left under his care slip away and thus put them in mortal danger, could now not even say thank you to Hazel, and all because of the existence of this ridiculous order born from a misunderstanding. Blame told how the main character, risking her own health, saved two children, completely unknown to her, but all the inhabitants of the palace continued to treat her as if she were empty space. And Langford is primarily to blame for all of this, whose precious pride the protagonist inadvertently hurt, and the shock on the blonde's face was so strong that he probably only miraculously stayed on his feet. And then it turned out that the rest of the Grand Masters had been secretly watching this scene. Kane, still in his sleep shirt, a shocked Louis, and even Siegbalt, who was supposed to be far away putting out fires. Meanwhile, Laurendale had again fallen on his knees and repeated his request that the law on boycotting the manager of the salon on the palace grounds be repealed, as the council members had found it to be unnecessary and harmful. As Langford listened to these words, his face became increasingly sweaty, and the lights of a silent scream grew brighter in his eyes, and the rest of the dignitaries finally entered the room and stood directly behind Blame. They were in no hurry to say anything, but their whole appearance demonstrated that they fully shared the position expressed by the elf and were ready to fight to defend it. Gallardo also thought that it was now very easy to guess what thoughts were raging in the head of the young king, because his face now showed a grimace of disbelief, resentment, and deep shock. In the end, the blonde forced himself to turn his face away, hiding his emotions from his supporters, and Laurendel's words echoed in his head about a self-confident and serious misunderstanding. When he looked in the mirror, his face was wet and gray with horror. Only now Langford realized that all these days he had been fighting not with a vile swindler trying to profit at his expense, like a parasite, but with an ordinary person. Only now did the unfortunate king realize what a fool he had made of himself. He had sincerely believed that the swindler had planned to take away a piece of land and sell it at an astronomical price, and all this talk about the farm was nothing more than a cover. Blame, perfectly understanding what a storm of emotions was now raging in his friend's soul, gently added that even the greatest ruler and military leader found it dangerous to play with nature. Like a butterfly that creates hurricanes on other continents with the flapping of its wings, even the most subtle intervention can have unpredictable consequences, and Louis added that she had said the same thing. And then she, more irritated, said that improvising, making decisions instantly and in complete solitude, can be very useful on the battlefield, when you and your supporters can be destroyed at any second, but not in a peaceful palace. After all, Zigbalt, Kahn, Gallardo, and Laurendel were members of a special council created to help Langford rule. But what good were they if the blonde wasn't willing to discuss decisions with his comrades? The elder Saxony even allowed himself a little joke, like, "Thank heavens that I am not really a king and am not capable of causing trouble on a truly large scale." Kane, with an even more sarcastic grin, repeated his words, like, even if he makes a mistake somewhere, then he can just forget about it without consequences. And now no one tried to remind him about the incident with the tree general. In any case, the beastman quickly added, his stupidities will not be added to the history books, to the desecration of future generations, and Zigbalt, trying not to laugh, asked to slow down, not to bring Langford to a breakdown. On the other hand, power, like a coin, had two sides. With its help, one could either arrange a catastrophic stupidity or correct it, and the young monarch could not deny this. It is not known what he would have decided in the end, because now Louis entered the picture. She made the most touching, good-natured, and thirsty grimace, which literally screamed, "Please, dear, at least do this for me." It was as if a volcano had awakened in Langford's soul. He mumbled incoherently, trying to figure out what would be the best way to act in such a situation, before finally giving a clear answer. No. And this almost made the knights fall to the floor from shock. Before they could say anything, the blonde continued his speech. Yes, he admitted that the advisors were completely right. The king made an unforgivable mistake when choosing a decision, he was guided not by objective information, but by emotions and belief in stereotypes. However, this was the only thing the young man was willing to agree with, and his flushed face and burning red eyes clearly hinted that any further attempt to put pressure would only result in heads flying, and not necessarily in a figurative sense. Realizing that this was the only victory they could achieve now, the aristocrats decided to back down, and Kane, in particular, with the kindest smile, suggested ending the discussion by simply allowing everyone to follow their own paths. But even so, there remained one more mistake that Langford was obliged to immediately correct, if of course he continued to consider himself a good and responsible ruler and not a tyrant. The autocrat acknowledged that this was a fair argument and merely asked what exactly he should do, and then the audience was shown a large, clean, transparent puddle in which Hazel's house was reflected. By order of the ruler, the court sorcerers removed the constant rain so that the sky became sunny and clear again, and thanks to this, Anna and Isabella of Saxony were able to go outside and admire the protagonist's garden. As it turned out from the thoughts of the surprised Edwina, the girls and Zigbalt were also beastmen, like Kane. They did not have protruding furry ears or tails, but they had a very strong and developed bare sense of smell, surpassing even a dog's. Thanks to this small natural advantage, the two young aristocrats, who had never done any agricultural work in their lives, were able to find the necessary plant even faster than May, who had been doing it all her life. They would really like the main character to plant this find at her place and enthusiastically show the place where you can pick more of these. However, the brunette was more concerned about the fact that Anna and Isabella were openly violating the royal law. However, Hazel, of course, was ready to accept the gift in any case, and mentally, in her own way, she praised the twins, admitting that it was very difficult to believe in their noble origin. At this point, a pleased Laurendale approached the group. The little girls greeted him with pleasure, but the farmer's wife became nervous because she was used to associating the elf with bad news. When the man addressed her directly, and even respectfully called her Miss Mayfield, the woman was truly horrified, and resolutely folding her arms across her chest, she shouted that the person Blame was addressing was not there. However, the Grandmaster was not going to continue to play along with this stupid rule. Looking straight into May's green eyes, the pointy-eared blonde sincerely thanked her for what she had done. Moreover, the official assured that now not only he himself, but all the elves who live in the Brotherhood will consider the protagonist their most reliable and loyal friend. It sounded so sudden and strange that Hazel, contrary to her usual manner, found no words to respond, and then Gallardo decided to join in with her gratitude. Taking her new little sister's hand, Louise smiled and expressed her gratitude, for the farmer had fed the vampire's subordinates the most delicious apple tart instead of trying to use a wooden stake. And, like Laurendale, the red-haired woman dared to speak not only for herself, but for an entire social group, in this case on behalf of the entire aristocracy of the kingdom. And then, as if from nowhere, Khan appeared, smiling in the way that only cats can. This long-eared and tailed young man assured that he and all his relatives would be indebted to Hazel for the rest of their lives. Of course, he understood perfectly well that he was also breaking the rule, and that such a thing would be punished mercilessly. But the Beastman still admitted that he considered Edwina a real hero, without any metaphors. And then, finally, Sigbalt, the older brother of Anna Sophia and Isabella, stepped forward, and he, of course, was deeply grateful to the protagonist for saving the future of his family. Smiling in a way that just the sight of his face could make plants bloom, the brown-haired man assured that he would never forget this selfless act of kindness. In another situation, May might have melted into a puddle of pleasure and pride, but now she only looked at the assembled group with apprehension. The woman could not understand what had bitten them all and made them openly ignore the boycott law. At this point, Count Rosender Albert, the man who had started the standoff between the royal court and Hazel, stepped forward and quietly assured the farmer that the decree had finally been repealed. This news was so devastating and unexpected that Edwina did not immediately find the strength to react in any way. She only widened her green emerald-like eyes and quietly whispered, "Minister." When the first, most intense surprise finally passed, the brunette quietly asked again whether the rule had really been cancelled, and the elderly aristocrat happily confirmed that it had. Now no one had to put on that silly straw hat act. Hazel and her newfound friends could now freely communicate and visit each other. And that's not all. The head of the Department of Palace Affairs also had the deed to Edwina's land, since even Langford eventually admitted that he had, to put it mildly, overreacted when he decided to call for endless rain to wash away the hated false swindler. The autocrat regretted that he had damaged the land of a completely innocent person, so as compensation he officially apologized, dropped all claims against May, recognized her right to private property, and on top of that came another small bonus. This bonus is an increase in the plot. Now the farm, or rather the protagonist's salon, extended a little further in all directions, so that the brunette no longer has to live in such cramped conditions. This touched the girl so much that she almost burst into tears. It would never have occurred to Edwina that the monarch would be the first to decide to bury the hatchet, apologize for it, and that those around him would try so hard for the sake of a humble farmer. However, in the end, the protagonist tried to refuse under the pretext that she simply could not forget what had happened so easily. Because of Langford, her precious beds and seedlings had died in the end. Then Albert tried, a little awkwardly, to explain that the king, of course, would never have thought of compensating for the destroyed plants. No, there was a big difference between an apology and compensation for the damage. The old man smiled slyly, thereby demonstrating that he had secretly obtained all the necessary documents from the sovereign. And finally, if the heroine did not succeed in this place, then the plot could really be sold for good money. Hazel couldn't help but admit that this was a valid argument, and that she had been stupid in trying to refuse. After all, no one had the right to mess around in her garden and then live as if nothing had happened. Edwina cleared her throat and announced that she accepted the gift with gratitude, and all her new friends, important generals and aristocrats, smiled happily, like children at a party. And the most enthusiastic, oddly enough, was demonstrated by Zigbalt, who had never even come close to May's plot before. The big guy wanted to help with the restoration of the farm so much that even Louis was a little scared. Then the vampiress gently stroked the beastman bear's back and reminded him that Hazel was a grown-up girl and knew more about farming, and this made the huge man feel sad, like a child who was denied a game. The elder Saxon really wanted to thank the protagonist for saving his little sisters, and Gallardo, with a sly smile, said that she knew a suitable way. This entire conversation took place in front of the main character, who, of course, carefully caught every word. Otherwise, who knows what might pop into the vampire's red head next? In the end, the leader of the Knights of the Sacred Flame only asked the brunette if she could treat them all to something tasty, and Zigbalt almost dropped his jaw at his feet from such a trick. For a moment he thought Louis had gone mad. After all, it was they, as debtors, who were obliged to thank the protagonist and not to eat up her supplies like some idle parasites. He tried to get the point across to the others, but he didn't even get to finish the first sentence, because Hazel happily invited everyone inside. It was not a pretense, an attempt to somehow get rid of unwanted visitors. On the contrary, Edwina literally turned pink with happiness and almost glowed like a tiny sun. She then asked her new friends to bring enough chairs for everyone, and the Grandmasters, without batting an eyelid, decided to take enough furniture from the palace, much to the shock of the other aristocrats. Moreover, Cain especially distinguished himself. While Gallardo and Lorendel took ordinary chairs, and Zigbalt took a modest stool, the Catman dragged a huge throne on his back, justifying himself by saying that he didn't have any other seat anyway. While they were sorting out this problem, Hazel herself, humming a song under her breath, was preparing dishes for her dear guests, enjoying her first full-fledged feast. When the ministers finally reached the house with the necessary furniture, the day had turned to sunset, but the main character was not offended. On the contrary, she herself had just finished the preparations and was even surprised by such a pleasant coincidence. When she opened the door, instead of the advisors, the author showed the audience Langford, as if the king had also decided to come to his new neighbor, although in fact the blonde remained in his palace. The autocrat was without his usual royal uniform, in a more informal outfit. He slowly tasted the expensive meat prepared by the best of chefs, but on his tongue this delicacy gave off only bitterness. Then the young man took a glass of exquisite wine, made from the most elite grape variety, but this drink, for which other drunkards would kill without a second thought, seemed to Langford a disgusting swill. And then his face turned gray and became covered in beads of sweat. It seemed that just a little more, and the unfortunate man would faint or lose consciousness from the incredible pain that was tearing his body and soul apart. At this point, Rosender Albert quietly entered the room and noted in a wise tone that if a person living with other people is forced to eat alone, then something in his life has gone wrong. The young king politely greeted his minister and, soon-to-be, his adopted uncle. His upbringing in an aristocratic environment also allowed the blonde to instantly hide his true emotions. The old nobleman confessed that he was passing by when he suddenly saw his sovereign dining in proud solitude, as if there was no one else in the palace, and this is a very unpleasant fate. While Langford tried to take at least a purely symbolic sip, the count continued mercilessly, "Your advantage is that you listen to your friends, but for some reason now these friends are not nearby, and there is no one to talk to." This clearly touched the young ruler to the quick, but for now he tried to contain the storm raging inside him. He only threw a gloomy look at Albert and said that everything had been decided today, that everyone should respect the opinion of the other, despite the differences. Accordingly, if they wanted to go to another place to have dinner, then let them. There is nothing catastrophic about it. But the old man added with a mocking smile that this other place was clearly more attractive than the palace dining room. And then, to rub the salt as deeply as possible into the wound, Rosander added that he had heard laughter from that very place, very cheerful and sincere laughter of many happy people. Before the king got angry and tore his head off, the head of the department advised him to just relax. After all, not everything in life needs to be done perfectly. Sometimes you can just go with the flow. Langford, looking at the table, replied that the minister would sing differently if he woke up every day to the disgusting stench of shit from the garden beds, but the old man easily retorted that even this was better than the omnipresent smell of freshly spilled blood in the palace. Of course, on the battlefield the blonde had no equal, but in the area of peaceful administrative affairs he still had a lot to learn. However, the king interrupted these moralizing lessons, asking him to join the table. Naturally, Rosander refused, with the most kind, good-natured, and smiling look, but it was a categorical no spoken to the face of the almost all-powerful monarch. Having suppressed the initial shock, Langford asked very quietly if Albert had not come all this way to dine with his master, and the minister responded with a look of confusion. The count's whole appearance showed that, on the one hand, he wanted to honor the young man, but at the same time, curiosity, unfortunately, turned out to be much stronger than his sense of duty. The expensive delicacies prepared by the royal chefs were worth nothing in Rosander's eyes compared to the modest but incredibly tasty dishes of the hostess of the salon. He was ready to come there even for the opportunity to smell these masterpieces. Langford asked suggestively if anyone could visit this, so to speak, salon at any time, but the count added with false regret that it was not that simple. It just so happens that the hostess has a whole pack of great knights as friends who will not hesitate to break the bones of anyone who is unpleasant to her and dares to show up uninvited. But the good old aristocrat, fortunately, is on the white list. Unlike some people, and the young monarch, judging by his angry, sullen face, instantly understood that this was an overt, poisonous jab at himself. In any case, Albert was very sorry that he could not share a meal with his sovereign, but he did not come empty-handed. Someone asked him to convey something to the autocrat. The blonde took the offered box and opened it with the utmost caution, clearly afraid of finding a snake or a scorpion inside. However, there were only small chocolates inside. Then Rosander gave the king a frankly mocking grin and said, "It seemed to me that you are too bitter now, and even you cannot choose your neighbors." Several hours passed. Night had finally fallen and most people were sleeping soundly, but Langford, the most powerful man in the Brotherhood, had no intention of falling asleep. From the height of his balcony, he looked at the protagonist's house and tried to understand what the hell this was all about. Why did those around him go crazy as soon as this girl appeared on the horizon? For the first time, the young ruler wanted to know what kind of person she was, not just find a way to kick her out of his former territory, but to really understand the situation. The next morning, readers were once again shown the Marinier farm in all its splendor. The once old, rickety house now sparkled and shimmered in the sun like a piece of amber. The picture was idyllic. Birds were singing among the trees, plants were blooming and filling with juices, an evil chipmunk was extorting acorns from a mole, and the protagonist went out for another job. But she froze when suddenly an unfamiliar voice was heard, and a strange man appeared in her field of vision, in a black uniform, with black hair, but covering his face with a large hat. He wondered if the famous straw hat lived here, and Hazel confirmed that the stranger had come to the right place, although the boycott law had already been repealed. The man removed his hat and bowed low, apologizing for something, and then turned abruptly and walked away under May's bewildered gaze, as if that was all he wanted to do. The main character looked after the weirdo for some time, trying to understand what it was all about. Wasn't he going to talk to her about something? This was the first incident, but far from the last. Since then, unusual guests began to visit the farm as if it were some kind of holy place or a cave with untold treasures. For example, an aristocratic elderly woman began to constantly hide behind the large lavender bushes, and at some point Edwina even stopped perceiving this with surprise. Looking at the next visit of the unknown old woman, the protagonist thought that she resembled a white doe, very beautiful but capricious, and that knight with a hat looked like a badger. The girl even thought sarcastically how strange it was. A badger, a doe. Well, who would fate bring to her house next? How strange would the next animal be? And fate, as if in response to these thoughts, immediately provided Hazel with another beast. Fortunately, it turned out to be Cane Lungband, already well known to her and the readers. The protagonist greeted her new friend and admitted that he should have come earlier, because the farmer's wife found some raisins, baked some excellent buns from them, but she herself couldn't resist eating them all. In response, the beastman smiled and asked if he came to May only to fill his belly, and immediately added that he had had a good lunch shortly before. Stepping inside, where his huge throne chair still stood, the catboy excitedly asked if Edwina was familiar with the concept of white noise. He was incredibly fond of the natural sounds of the Mariniere farm. And the reason was incredibly trivial. The chirping, the rustling of leaves and branches in the wind, and the sounds of a hoe hitting the ground all had a first-class effect on increasing concentration. And then Cane simply took out some book, sat down on his comically huge chair, and asked the brown-haired girl not to pay attention to him. He would just read something and then leave. The protagonist, albeit with slight doubt, agreed, but when 1 hour had passed, Lundband had no intention of leaving. On the contrary, he fell asleep right in his huge throne. Realizing that at this rate she would soon have another mountain on her fragile shoulders, Hazel quietly approached the beast man and politely asked if he needed to return to the palace, but the dozing youth almost hit his head in surprise. Realizing that he had overindulged in someone else's hospitality, the cat immediately ran into the palace, but quickly returned when he was reminded of the huge chair that the small, fragile Caen had dragged with difficulty into a remote corner of the house. In any case, the girl was more happy than upset. After all, a decent farm is unthinkable without a cat, and she just happened to have her own. A little more time passed, and then Luis Gallardo decided to show up for a visit. Peeking out from around the corner, the vampire asked if she could come in, flashing her sharp fangs from under her lip. But it so happened that she also chose an unfortunate moment for her visit, as it quickly became clear the protagonist was going to go to the market for groceries, so she could not arrange a feast. The red-haired woman immediately imposed herself as a companion. She loved Hazel so much that she was ready to completely abandon important state affairs in order to be with her a little longer. At the same time, she playfully asked the main character how much money she had, and when she heard that it was just over 170 gold coins, she was delighted because she would be able to go for a walk. However, the warrior's delight instantly evaporated as soon as Edwina admitted that this money was the entire amount that the brunette had painstakingly saved for 2 whole years. The next frame shows readers the usually cheerful Gallardo standing on a stool and whining that this is why she has no friends, much to the horror of one of the younger vampires. But Louis didn't pay any attention to her subordinate. She just continued to cry and think that May must have left long ago, and the farmer's wife really enjoyed her time at the market. Edwina was extremely pleased. Everything had gone exactly as well as it needed to, as if the heavens themselves had smiled especially broadly at her this time. At the same time, His Majesty Langford was working in his office. He was not wearing the usual blue uniform, but a relatively simple black suit used by various knights. And in front of him was a box with 2, at first glance, ordinary bottles. But in fact these were magical potions, with the help of which a mortal could change his appearance. The elixir was good, even excessively so, which is why it was banned throughout the entire Britannia. But the blonde believed that he had the right to some liberties, so he resolutely reached for one of the bottles and dropped the contents into his eyes. The potion worked. Within a few seconds, Langford's ruby-red eyes turned blue, and then he used ordinary paint to turn his golden hair black. His own mother would not have recognized the ruler of the Britannia in the resulting man. A young and handsome but generally unremarkable knight looked out of the mirror. The king was clearly uncomfortable. His collar seemed to be constricting his throat, and his body was alternately hot and cold, but he ordered himself to concentrate on the task at hand. Pulling his hood tighter, the young ruler went outside, and outside it was already late evening. The sky was a rich orange hue, and here and there you could see the stars. So far, everything was going according to plan. Numerous courtiers were exchanging gossip, going somewhere on their own business, and no one even thought to look at the black-haired guy with silver eyes. He came close to Hazel's house, and looking at it, made an oath that from now on, for a month, he would watch a new opponent for a long time every day. Being a natural-born commander who had won many wars, Langford intended to collect all possible information about the protagonist in this way, to identify all her weak points. Here the sovereign's attention was drawn to something else. Looking down, he saw not a trap or an angry Gallardo with a blade, but an ordinary chicken. Seeing a stranger with suspicious intentions, the chick chirped very loudly and even attacked him like a fighting dog, but the guy managed to intercept him and clamp his beak with his fingers. It was at this moment that the protagonist appeared as if from underground, and she experienced a real shock when she saw an unknown man fighting Tiberius. A very awkward moment occurred. Langford stared at May with his mouth open, even forgetting about the bloodthirsty bird, and the brunette, in turn, was ready to scream at the top of her lungs, seeing the evil tormentor of animals. The entire plan of the brilliant military leader went down the drain before it was even born. The young king was going to talk to Hazel only after a month of close observation, but she managed to stumble upon him on the very first day. The farmer's wife, fortunately, calmed down, and now did not try to get into a fight as one might have thought at first. Folding her arms across her chest, she seriously replied that if the stranger wanted to interrogate Tiberius, he should have known that the chicken spoke a chicken version of bro-speak. In other words, this chick wasn't a spy, so there was no need to continue squeezing him as if Langford was about to cook chicken stew, but the boy was so surprised that he didn't immediately understand the meaning of what was said. Very slowly, the masked sovereign raised his hands to the ground, unclenched his fingers, and the chicken ran away with a loud chirp, while the people remained exchanging tense, suspicious glances. The boy took slow, deep breaths, trying to get his thoughts in order and figure out how to proceed, and it was as if he was struck by a whip when Hazel said, "Are you thinking about how to hide your true identity now?" The sovereign could no longer bother himself with this. The main character had already understood who he really was, and the former blonde was truly horrified when he realized how easily he had been identified. The man ran up to the woman and shouted that it was all a lie, but she calmly added, "You are actually the king's secret inspector, aren't you?" To his enormous surprise. The info footnote helpfully explained that the secret inspector of the royal palace is a special official who is allowed to spy on the citizens of the Britannia to detect illegal activities such as growing narcotic plants, dumping waste into rivers, and even abuse of domestic animals. Edwina didn't think it was a bad thing, because following the laws was very important, but she couldn't understand. For what purpose did His Majesty send a spy to her, an absolutely law-abiding lady with a conscience as clear as the first snow? Considering herself the mistress of the situation, Hazel directly warned the official that his efforts were futile. It was useless to try to deceive someone who knew in advance about your actions and motives. So now let him be a good boy and tell his name. But as for Langford himself, he mentally rejoiced at such luck. May turned out to be not as smart as she thought herself. However, the king understood that it was pointless to try to carry out a plan that had already failed, so he simply turned around and walked away, ignoring the girl's cries. "If you don't come back and give your name, I will consider you a suspicious person." She even threatened that otherwise she would start spreading rumors about it. And for some reason, this threat frightened the ruler, although he could easily forget about it, simply returning to his old appearance. The man seriously thought about how he could get out of this extremely unpleasant situation with minimal damage, while the protagonist continued to ask him his name. He ended up blurting out the first name that came to mind, Valentine, and the main character even wrote it down in a little green book, as if she herself were a government official keeping an eye on suspicious citizens. She did, however, admit that she writes down the names of all the aristocrats who come to visit her, and not for any suspicious purposes, but simply so as not to get confused about who is called what. But she immediately added with an innocent look that the false Valentine specifically had something to worry about, and then again brought the small green book and pen to her face. And the reason, oddly enough, was that the unfamiliar brunette behaved and communicated completely differently from the other knights. And this argument sincerely put the disguised Langford. The next argument was no less compelling. The young man behaved much more rudely than all the other warriors Edwina knew, and this was very ugly, considering that he was supposed to be the king's representative. Listening to all these moralizing, the disguised sovereign bit his lip so as not to laugh or break into an angry cry, because he, of course, was not going to observe formalities with the man whom he currently hated more than anything in the world. And then the humiliation only increased. Hazel asked if the rude visitor was sick with something, and when he said yes, she noted with a smile that in that case she was obliged to understand the fool's position. And then she said in a very stern tone, "Sir Valentine, who cannot behave politely because of the birth pain, open your eyes wider and look at this field." The protagonist pointed her finger at her garden and demanded to know if there was something there that he was looking for, and Langford actually had no idea what Edwina was talking about, but he knew he had to give some kind of answer. The man couldn't think of anything better to do than simply say yes, and this caused Hazel such a terrible shock that she almost collapsed right on the spot where she had just been standing. Clutching the brim of her straw hat so hard that it nearly tore in half, the woman screamed that she didn't have any drugs, just ordinary homegrown vegetables and other greens. There was a very awkward pause as Langford managed to forget what his own subordinates did and made a fool of himself, while Hazel gave him a very pointed look and asked in the tone of an angry cat what kind of attitude this was. Clutching her own limbs, Edwina muttered in disgust and shock that she simply couldn't believe that the pseudo-Valentine didn't understand such things. However poorly she usually thought of the king, May was at least sure that he would have sent someone who knew about farming to check. But how deep must the disrespect be to send such an illiterate blockhead? And then an even more terrible guess came into her head. In fact, Langford needed a casus belli, a legitimate reason for aggression, so he specially sent the dumbest of his bloodhounds, because only a complete amateur in the garden could find something suspicious on the Mariniere farm. Hazel put her hands to her chest in a very dramatic manner and began to lament how cruel and meticulous the monarch was, and that Valentine could go back to the palace right now and report, "Let the jailers come here with shackles." As for the autocrat himself, he actually watched this performance with his mouth wide open. The man was so shocked that he couldn't even think, "What kind of circus is this?" The young man realized that he was too tired of participating in this performance of the burnt-out theater, so he simply said that he would not report anything to anyone if only Hazel would stop screaming already. Looking at his calm and detached mask-like face, the protagonist herself felt ashamed of the drama she had just created. After all, what was Valentine to blame for? He was nothing more than a servant carrying out the will of his superiors. So May bowed low to the guy and sincerely apologized for her outrageous behavior, but the disguised Langford only felt even more awkward and tried to convince his interlocutor not to do it. And then another awkward moment happened. The same old newspaper fell out of the main character's pocket, in which it was mockingly written how the great conqueror king of Britannia was conquered by just one girl who claimed rights to her grandfather's old farm. Realizing that at this rate she would be seriously accused of disrespecting the crown, the brunette quickly declared that she was not holding on to the newspaper because of what was written there. It was just that waste paper was good for washing windows, so Edwina was dragging old paper around whenever she could. Feeling the first icy chills running down her spine, the girl reminded him just in case that the Britannia was a country of free morals and broad opportunities, and not a dictatorship where the government could easily shut people's mouths and burn down publishing houses. Of course, if you don't count one inspector who most rudely shut the beak of one small, innocent chicken, and Langford felt Spanish shame again after these words. But then the protagonist suddenly shared her old experiences on the topic of politics. When she was little, there was a very cruel and paranoid king in power who mercilessly killed anyone who seemed disrespectful to him. But then he died and people breathed a sigh of relief. In short, she thought the current ruler was actually quite good, and Langford blushed as he heard praise from the one he least expected it from. But now her opinion of the royal majesty had sunk below the ocean floor, and the disguised monarch once again felt like an awkward blockhead who was breaking wood with every step he took. It was such a disgusting feeling that the young sovereign quickly forgot that he was, in fact, the ruler of a huge and powerful country, the winner of wars and conqueror. He simply wanted to return to his room and curl up in a corner. Feeling the aura of black melancholy emanating from the man, the protagonist again felt a pang of conscience. Having given free rein to her sarcasm, she, not being whole herself, turned the conversation to a very slippery and unpleasant topic. Smiling now sincerely without any hint of mockery, Hazel apologized once again to Valentine. She did not think that he was an honest worker who wanted to give his superiors a sincere report and unfairly took him for a slanderer and an idiot. She also invited the brunette to visit her house despite the late hour, and the disguised king actually went inside, despite the fact that he himself did not understand why he was doing it at all. As a further apology, Edwina was about to treat the new guest to dinner, but the pseudo-inspector tried to refuse, only to suddenly find the girl standing right next to him, looking up intently. She said nothing, but continued to look as if she were trying to look into his very soul, and the sovereign immediately decided that he had finally been recognized, and began to reproach himself for not running away at the first opportunity. This continued for a few more seconds before the woman pointed her finger at the young man's chest, where a precious necklace hung, and Langford mentally sighed with relief, realizing that his person was safe. Gently squeezing the elongated stone, shimmering with green light, the main character began the story. Once he sailed from Ababos to Elanomia, and his ship got caught in a storm. This jewel was given to the false Valentine by a wise old man. He said nothing, but his expression was so eloquent that the king did not need any words. The emperor was sure that this gemstone hid some secret, some magical ability, truth, or at least something that would make it something more than just a piece of rock. However, no matter how much Langford struggled with this riddle, he was never able to find a solution. Over time, this stone was nicknamed Philosopher's Stone, referring to the fact that it made people puzzle, but had no other value. However, Hazel, having heard this story, asked a little smugly, "I wouldn't say that, isn't it a seed?" Squeezing the talisman tightly, the king pounced on the girl with questions about what kind of seed it was, and the brunette suddenly shrugged her shoulders, admitting that she didn't really know either. When the pseudo-inspector regained his voice and asked why the hell Edwina had ever decided that the jewel was actually a seed from some plant, May simply replied, "It's obvious." From her point of view, this was an incredibly simple and even stupid question, the same as asking another person how he distinguishes a dog from a cat or another intelligent creature. She, again, did not know the name of the plant that produced such unusual seeds, and she thought deeply about it. In particular, she clarified whether Valentine really received this gift from the old guru from the unusual island kingdom. The brunette admitted that the old man hadn't told him anything, but he had such kind, pleading eyes, as if he desperately wanted the king to understand what secret was hidden behind this gift. The main character's solution, like that of any farmer, was extremely practical. She simply suggested planting a stone seed and then seeing what miracle would grow out of it. And the protagonist thought seriously about this. On the one hand, such a proposal sounded frankly meaningless, but on the other, what if Hazel was right after all, and some good would come of it? After all, no other person the king knew had ever tried to suggest something like that, and the young man agreed with May, and even suggested trying to plant the gem on her plot. The readers, however, were not shown the end of the conversation. Instead, the action immediately moved to another day. The court sages and sorcerers were discussing another experiment when His Majesty suddenly descended upon them, now in his natural golden-haired and red-eyed form. He asked one of the magicians if this gem could be the seed of a certain plant, and the man, for some reason sweating heavily and thinking, "Is this really proof?" carefully answered that it all depends on the point of view. Ultimately, everything is relative. Things can change their essence depending on how others look at them, and if the king calls the emerald a seed, then who would dare argue with that? Langford's jaw nearly dropped after listening to this philosophical stream of consciousness, and when he recovered from the shock, he grabbed the thinker by the shoulders and demanded to know whether a stone could be a piece of flora from the point of view of applied science. Then the courtier, without batting an eyelid, replied that the philosopher's stone is a mineral, but not all minerals are seeds, and from this one can conclude that the extended stone is also not a seed. The crowned youth listened to this with a sad face, and then explained that he literally needed to know whether this jewelry was part of a plant, and the other philosopher, realizing that the king was beginning to get angry, carefully added that if it is a seed, then it cannot be anything other than a seed. The blonde realized that he wouldn't achieve anything worthwhile in this department and decided to go and ask the biologist, but in the end the audience was shown how he had settled in his office and was staring at the mysterious gift. He couldn't get the protagonist's suggestion out of his head. The idea that an apparent gem might actually be part of the reproductive process of some bush or tree sounded crazy, but Langford thought about it over and over again. Then a biologist knocked on the door of the office, and he finally told the ruler the good news. The main character was right. This really was the seed of an unknown plant, but it was covered with a very hard shell, like an egg. The autocrat was very surprised that Hazel, an ordinary girl with talents for agriculture, was right, but he did not say so. Instead, he asked the scientist if it was possible to plant an object in the ground. The older man in glasses cautiously informed them that if they were right in their guess, then most likely, yes. So he put the strange seed in a pot and decided to put it in a sunny spot. But absolutely nothing happened, and the unfortunate scientist fell to his knees in horror, begging the ruler not to kill him, but Langford was not angry. In fact, he was rather interested in such an unexpected turn of events. Having peacefully let go of the stuttering and trembling with horror sage, the young sovereign remembered Hazel with irritation. She was absolutely confident in her words, and in the end, what, she simply made the blonde make a fool of himself? Suddenly, a figure wrapped in a hooded cassock approached the monarch. The unknown man replied that there was only one way to accurately determine the nature of the strange jewel. But it wasn't some creepy sorcerer, but the same old man with a bow in his beard who helped Langford summon endless rain, and his solution was to cut the mineral into 2 even halves to see what was inside. Realizing that in this way he would only kill a possible embryo, the crowned youth ordered the scientist to step away, and he himself tiredly sprawled in his chair. Like, what is this? Not a single smart person in the area. But then the young man looked again at the mysterious little stone lying on the pincushion and thought with a hint that he did have one more or less reliable acquaintance. They were clearly talking about the main character, because Langford, having barely thought of this idea, immediately rejected it. They say, nothing will come of it. The reason was elementary simple. Hazel did not know that she had personally met the king. She still continued to think that she had made the acquaintance of Inspector Valentine, and if the girl found out how things really were, it would be a disaster. With such gloomy thoughts, the sovereign walked through the palace. His legs led him through luxurious corridors, past halls filled with expensive carpets and furniture, and eventually led him out onto the street, where something strange was happening. It was a group of palace pages led by the young blonde Raphael. They were dragging a heavy log, but as soon as they saw their master, they dropped their burden and hastily bowed. Raising his head, one of the boys admitted that they were actually heading for the 79th section, which even now they try not to talk about too much in the palace. And they have done this before, since they take a log to Marigny's farm every day. Here the 2 young men began to argue quietly. One of them reminded them that the owner of the farm salon would melt down the scroll again if her deliverers encountered anyone, but Raphael objected that they moved quietly and unnoticed, like the wind. Then they remembered that the king, who was known for his dislike of the new neighbor, was right there, listening attentively to every word, and again they bowed their heads, begging for forgiveness. They probably expected a harsh punishment, like hard labor in the kitchen, a flogging, or even dismissal, but Langford ended up simply walking away, leaving a last word for the pages to continue with their business. As soon as the sovereign had moved a sufficient distance away, one of the servants began to curse fate, which had rewarded them with such an unpleasant meeting. The boy was ready for the enraged king to simply order them all to be killed. And somewhere in the palace, 4 grandmasters were exchanging funny stories. Lorendel, in particular, was telling how Zigbalt had gotten out of an unpleasant embarrassment with the help of a chair. Gallardo then added that she was interested in when Hazel would finally cut the throne of the disgusting fairy king into pieces. She had given her friends her word that she would not let them down. Here they froze like pillars of salt because Langford passed by them, who apparently became the prototype of the aforementioned king. A very unpleasant and awkward silence reigned, which only Kane tried to dilute with a friendly greeting, but the autocrat ultimately simply moved on, as if his own generals were empty space for him. The aristocrats realized that they had clearly gone too far during their last argument over the protagonist, so they decided to come to the king later and carefully apologize. The monarch, meanwhile, retired to his study where he found documents, a certificate of identity of Hazel Edwina May, the granddaughter of Baron Mailfield. Langford, on the one hand, did not want to go to her, but he had to finally reveal the secret of the stone, so he went to the farm again in the guise of Valentine.